Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where your daily wardrobe isn't a casual decision. It's a survival challenge, a class indicator, and occasionally a felony. You wake up on a scratchy straw mattress in a one-room cottage with a roof that leaks during the full moon, and before your feet hit the packed dirt floor, you're already mentally preparing to lace-wrap button buckle and squeeze yourself into what could generously be called an outfit, but really looks more like medieval origami. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that touches your skin is your linen shift, a humble, slightly grimy knee-length garment that acts as the foundation for everything else. It's not sexy, it's not sleek, it's basically a long, baggy t-shirt, and it's the only thing you'll wash with any regularity. You pull it over your head, feeling its rough fibres graze your arms like a disinterested cat. Congratulations, you've begun the hour-long ritual known as getting dressed in the 14th century. You reach for your brays, essentially cloth boxer shorts that tie at the waist. They're voluminous and a little breezy, which sounds nice until winter hits, and you realise they do nothing to stop the cold from creeping into your soul. Next come your hose, which are separate pieces for each leg. You bend over to pull them up, which is tricky with your shift flapping in the way, and your lower back already staging a rebellion. One hose slides up, the other resists like a toddler refusing bedtime. And here's the kicker, these leg coverings don't stay up on their own. You need a belt or points-long laces that tie to your doublet to keep everything from falling. No elastic waistbands here, no lycra, just you, a length of cord, and a prayer. By now, your entire lower half looks like it's been cocooned by a slightly confused spider. You could stop here if you're a peasant, and it's a casual Tuesday. But chances are you've still got 3 to 5 layers to go. A kirtle, a tunic, maybe even a surcoat if you're feeling spicy. And yes, there are buttons. Lots of buttons. Sometimes up the front, sometimes up the sides, sometimes placed purely to mess with you. Lacing is another medieval specialty. Think corset strings, but without the Victoria's Secret glamour. You tighten your laces until you can't quite breathe, and you wonder if anyone back then had abs, or if they just relied on compression. Historians still argue whether medieval folks got dressed completely alone, or required help from others like aristocratic NASCAR pit crews. Given the number of layers, clasps, ties, and traps involved, it's likely most people did a little of both solo dressing for everyday use and assistance for those extra churchy Sundays or royal events where your sleeves alone could warrant a supporting cast. Oh, and don't forget your shoes. They're made of leather so thin it might as well be parchment. Pointy-toed if you're fashionable, rounded if you're not. Either way, no arch support, no insulation, and about as waterproof as a dried leaf. You step outside and immediately regret it. Mud to the ankles again. Now add a belt. Not just for show, but to hold your knife keys pouch and maybe a coin or two if you're rich or lucky. It's essentially your medieval purse and utility belt combined. Batman would be proud. You're sweating already even though it's barely dawn. That's the thing with medieval clothes, they were designed more for display than comfort. The wealthier you are, the less likely your outfit will allow for trivial things like movement or air circulation. If you can walk up a hill without tripping over your hem or passing out from heatstroke, you're not doing fashion right. But here's the strange part for all its complications. Medieval dress had an internal logic. Your clothing wasn't just about vanity, it told the world who you were. Married or single, rich or poor, farmer or friar. Sometimes even what you ate or which village you were from. There were actual laws called sumptuary laws that dictated what colours, fabrics and cuts different classes could wear. If you violated them, you risked fines, or worse, social ridicule. Imagine getting roasted in the town square not for your politics, but because your cloak was dyed the wrong shade of blue. A mainstream historical fact, the basic linen shift, worn as an underlayer by virtually everyone regardless of class, is one of the most enduring garments in pre-modern Europe. It was simple, functional, and surprisingly democratic. Quirky tidbit, medieval people believed that lacing your clothing in a spiral rather than straight down the middle would help twist away evil spirits. So yes, your corset might literally have been ghost-proof. And while scholars agree on the basics of medieval fashion, there's still lively debate about how often clothes were washed or even changed. Some argue weekly at best. Others suggest the wealthier class might have owned more changes of garments than we assume. Either way, Fabrizi did not exist. By the time you finish dressing, you're exhausted. But at least you look strange, elaborate, striking, like you've stepped out of a manuscript illumination complete with impractical sleeves and the faint whiff of sheep. Now grab your cloak. It's market day, and that sack of turnips isn't going to carry itself. You step into the cold morning mist, your cloak slung over one shoulder like a soggy curtain. Its scratchy smells like damp straw, and if you're lucky it's fastened with a brooch that hasn't rusted shut. This cloak isn't for style. It's a survival blanket that you wear while pretending you don't mind the icy wind slicing through your hose. Your shoes squelch as you walk toward the village each step, a reminder that leather soles were never meant for muddy paths. A goose honks at you from someone's doorway, a few chickens scurry past and smoke rises from the chimneys, well holes in the roof really. You nod at the baker's apprentice who's somehow wearing even more layers than you, including a hat shaped like an overturned soup bowl. Everyone's clothes are strange by modern standards, but to them it's just Tuesday. You pass a man with hose so tight they could double as sausage casings, his tunic slit nearly to the hip, not for fashion. Mind you, but so he can ride a horse without splitting the seams. Function first, though it's hard to take him seriously with those feathered shoes. You reach the edge of the market square and suddenly it hits you colour. Not just browns and greys, but saffron yellows, russet reds, deep indigo, and the occasional scandalous green. These aren't muted peasants anymore. These are tradesmen guild members, wives of minor nobility, and they are wearing their social status on their sleeves, literally. Clothing was a language back then, and you're barely fluent. A woman walks by in a tightly laced kirtle with sleeves so long they trail behind her like twin scarves. It's not practical, but it screams, I don't do manual labour, which is exactly the point. The brighter the colour, and finer the weave, the higher her rank, or her husband's rank to be precise. And that fur trim, it's rabbit not ermine, but no one's going to check if she doesn't fall down. Historians still argue whether such displays were sincere status symbols, or just desperate acts of imitation by the rising merchant class. After all, when the difference between noble and new money is an extra 2 inches of silk, lining every inch counts. A historical fact to keep in your satchel, sumptuary laws in places like England and France explicitly banned certain classes from wearing expensive materials like gold thread silk, or even specific colours like purple, which was reserved for royalty. That's right, your favourite hoodie colour could have gotten you fined. And speaking of colours, here's a quirky little tidbit. In some towns, dyeing your clothes with madder root for a rich red hue was so prized that guilds kept recipes secret, passing them down like family heirlooms. Dyers were basically the medieval version of influencers, except they worked with vats of urine and fermented lichen instead of ring lights and brand deals. You make your way through the stalls, careful not to trip on the hem of your surcoat, and you notice the strange silhouettes around you. Wide shoulders, narrow waists, oddly shaped hats. The men's tunics are cut higher now, exposing their hose-covered thighs in a look that screams night on casual Friday. You see one man with a codpiece, yes, that kind of codpiece, boldly protruding, like a stitched-in conversation starter. It's padded, it's puffed, it's absurd. And yet, not unusual. You think of how fashion has always teetered between function and flamboyance, and medieval Europe. It leaned so far into the flamboyant it practically tripped over its own poulaines, those long pointy shoes that could extend up to 24 inches past the toes. Imagine trying to flee from bandits in those. You'd be stylish and dead. But the truly strange part, these extremes weren't reserved for the elite. Even commoners mimicked the trends as best they could, albeit with cheaper fabric, shorter hems, or fewer embellishments. Because even in a world without Instagram, people still cared about how they looked. A lot. And why not? In a time when most folks didn't have mirrors, your outfit was your biography, your social resume, your first impression, last impression, and probably your funeral shroud all stitched into one. You pass by the town crier who's wearing a patched-up surcoat with faded embroidery, bellowing news of a royal birth somewhere far away. He clutches a bell in one hand and a crust of bread in the other. His stockings don't match. One's green, the other's brown. You try not to stare, but you can't help it. It's like a walking jigsaw puzzle of cloth and chaos. Here's the thing. Tailoring wasn't standardized. Clothes were custom cut or hand-me-downs, and patterns were more suggestion than science. So yes, Things didn't always match. Sleeves were detachable. Necklines shifted from modest to scandalous depending on the mood of the local bishop. Belts could be rope chain or braided fabric, and if something didn't fit, you pinned it, tied it, or pretended it did. Fashion was improvised survival, and it showed. And yet there's something charming about the whole scene. The slightly crooked seams, the exaggerated shoulders, the silly hats. These aren't just costumes from a Renaissance fair. These are real people trying to stay warm, stay respectable, and maybe get noticed by that fishmonger's daughter. You feel a breeze whip through your cloak and you wrap it tighter. Your fingers brush the coarse wool and you wonder how many people it took to make just this one garment. The spinner, the dyer, the weaver, the tailor, the shepherd who raised the sheep. You're not just wearing clothes, you're wearing a village. You duck into a side alley to avoid the sudden bustle of a passing ox cart, the wheels churning up yesterday's mud, today's manure, and probably a few relics from last week. The air smells of hay ash and sweat, your own included, and the fabric at your shoulder is damp again. Of course it is. You've been out for hours, and your cloak is made of wool thick enough to soak up an argument. Around the corner you find yourself staring at a tailor's shop, not that it has a sign. The clue is in the window, a headless wooden mannequin draped in half a tunic, a basket of thread spools and a pair of scissors that look heavy enough to castrate a bull. A boy leans out the door, whistling through his missing front teeth, wearing hose that don't quite match one leg, teal one mustard. He's clearly a tailor's apprentice, or possibly a walking fabric sampler. Inside, you catch a glimpse of the tailor himself bent over a table with a strip of linen in his mouth, measuring by teeth length. No joke, tailors back then often used body parts as tools, a handspan for a hem, an arm's length for cloth. If you've ever guessed your size by holding up a shirt to your torso and squinting congratulations, you're practicing medieval sizing. Historians still argue whether most garments were truly tailored or just roughly hacked to fit the general shape of a potato sack. Judging by the way that Merchant's tunic is clinging to him like a wet leaf, maybe it's both. Outside the village continues its slow-motion dance. You spot a woman carrying a bundle of reeds on her back, wrapped tight in a faded red shawl. The colour used to be brilliant, you imagine. Maybe even cochineal, an expensive dye made from crushed beetles. But now it's sun-worn and grimy, the beetle blood glory faded into an everyday brownish blush. You pass a cobbler's stall where rows of shoes dangle like fruit. All are handmade, most are low-cut. Some have wooden soles strapped on with leather cords. One pair is absurdly long-toed, curling up at the ends like wicked grins. The cobbler catches your eye and shrugs as if to say, they paid extra for the toes. Here's your quirky tidbit of the day. Poulaines. The pointy shoes were sometimes so exaggerated that men had to tie the tips to their garters to walk. Fashion over function. Absolutely. And also kind of hilarious. You imagine tripping over your own shoes while trying to court someone only to be helped up by the same ridiculous footwear. Across the way, a noble servant stands holding a bolt of fabric clearly waiting for instructions. You admire the silk sheen, the slight shimmer of gold thread, and realise this isn't local. It's from far off, maybe the east. Somewhere with trade routes and caravans and coin. Somewhere where people don't have to dry their underclothes over a smoky fire pit. The servant, of course, doesn't get to wear the silk. He wears a plain tunic, brownish-grey, with the faint impression of repeated elbow patching. You glance at his shoes, sturdy but cracked. One lace has been replaced with twine. His status is clear before he even opens his mouth. And that really is the whole point of clothing back then. It spoke before you did. Remember those sumptuary laws. They didn't just say who couldn't wear what. They policed appearances. If a merchant got too rich and dressed above his station, he could be fined or humiliated. Social mobility. Sure, but only if your sleeves weren't too long. Some historians argue that fashion became a battleground between aspiration and control. Each layer of cloth was a step up or a reminder to stay in your place. Either way, your wardrobe was a walking resume written in thread and judged by everyone. You head toward the centre of the square where a group of minstrels are performing. One wears a tunic of alternating panels green and gold like a court jester slashed at the sleeves to reveal a contrasting fabric underneath. It looks theatrical, but this isn't a costume. Slash and puff was a trend, sometimes even stuffed with contrasting cloth to look richer. Yes, they were faking wealth with sleeves. You wonder what medieval Instagram would have looked like. Blessed and slashed. You chuckle at the thought, then catch sight of a woman with a headdress shaped like a butterfly-winged fabric panels stiffened and balanced on either side of her head. You try not to stare, but it's like someone mounted a sailboat on her skull. She walks with poise, though clearly proud. That's not just cloth, it's architecture. These headdresses, called hennin's horns or butterfly veils, weren't just about fashion. They were power statements, spatial weapons, declarations of wealth and status that entered the room before the wearer did. Some extended over a foot above the head. One particularly famous example was so tall it supposedly required scaffolding underneath. Historians still argue whether these were functional, ceremonial, or just desperate cries for attention from bored aristocrats. You see her turn toward a stall and the wind catches her veil, lifting it gently. For a second she looks like a falcon mid-flight. Ridiculous, beautiful, utterly impractical. And that's medieval fashion for you. You round the corner and find yourself back by the fire pit where you started this morning. You sit, stretch your legs, feel the ache settle in your knees, your hose pinch a little, your tunic rides up a bit in the back. The draft returns, sneaking through the seams like gossip. You tug your cloak tighter and think this outfit, as uncomfortable as it is a story of wool and status, of rules and rebellion, of fashion as survival and theatre. The fire crackles, a neighbour throws in some dry twigs. You hear laughter from down the lane. A child shrieks chasing a chicken with a turnip. And you sit wrapped in wool watching it all, the weird and the wondrous stitched into every hem. The afternoon sun starts its lazy descent, casting long shadows that stretch like ribbons across the uneven village square. You shift your weight, feeling the stiff tug of your hose around the knees. Nobody tells you how hard it is to sit gracefully in medieval legwear. It's like trying to bend in a sausage casing. Eventually you give up and sprawl a little like the baker's cat you spotted earlier, half-baked on a windowsill and clearly living its best bread-adjacent life. You glance around and notice a pair of children clambering over a low wall, one wearing what might have once been a tunic, but now looks more like a strategically arranged sack. Their sleeves flap behind them like sails. One of them has a head wrap tied like a knotted potato bag. Practical, yes, but also part of a bigger story. Children wore scaled-down versions of adult clothes. There were no baby onesies or kids' tees with funny slogans. If you were 4 years old, you still wore a kirtle. If you were 10, you likely dressed just like your mum or dad, just muddier. Historians still debate how children's clothes evolved during the Middle Ages. Some argue they had looser fits for comfort and growth. Others insist most kids were simply expected to grow into what they were handed, and that often meant tripping over hems until their ankles caught up. A boy tumbles to the ground and bursts out laughing. His hat falls off a soft felt coif tied under the chin with strings, the medieval version of a security blanket. It's stained, it's wrinkled, and it might have been inherited from 3 older cousins. But it does its job, keeping his head warm, his hair mostly clean, and his parents vaguely reassured. Another boy runs past you in what looks like a linen shirt and not much else. You blink. Yep, just the shirt. This too was a thing, especially for lower income families in warm months. Why wear hose when you can just not wear hose? The answer, chafing. But until then, run free little tunic rebel. As you stroll toward the thatched houses lining the road, you spot an old woman sitting outside spinning wool. Her hands move with quiet rhythm, fingers dancing across the drop spindle. She's wrapped in layers and underdress of faded green, a woolen overgown the colour of damp leaves and a kerchief tied at the nape of her neck. Every inch of her clothing tells a story of age, of usefulness, of someone who's earned the right not to care what people think anymore. You catch her muttering under her breath, and for a second you imagine she's cursing the sheep, or the bishop, or both. Here's your historical fact of the hour. Spinning and weaving were the domain of women, and often done at home. Most peasant households produced at least some of their own fabric. Linen came from flax wool from sheep, and both were spun into thread, then woven on looms that took up half the room. Fashion didn't start in a castle, it started at the hearth. A curious tidbit floats into your mind during particularly lean years. People sometimes padded their garments with moss or feathers for insulation. It sounds like an Etsy nightmare, but hey, if it keeps your kidneys from freezing, you go with it. The road leads toward the manor house, its timber frame looming like a stern librarian. You approach slowly, squinting at the silhouettes moving in the courtyard. Here clothing shifts tone. The servants wear functional garb, plain wool tunics belted at the waist hose, patched and repatched, and sturdy aprons stained with chores. But the steward, He's got flair. His sleeves are wide and flowing, lined with crimson and trimmed with embroidery. You're pretty sure he did not stitch himself. He walks with the measured dignity of someone who has never knelt to scrub a chamber pot and never intends to. You pause near the entrance as a noble woman steps into view. Her gown is a marvel-fitted bodice, trailing sleeves and a neckline that dips just enough to say, "Yes, I own mirrors." She wears a jewelled girdle that glints in the low light and a veil that sways as she walks pinned beneath a crisp white wimple. The layering is intentional underdress surcoat cloak. Each fabric costs more than your entire flock of imaginary sheep. But beyond luxury, there's strategy. These clothes structure her body shape, how she moves, and make sure everyone knows exactly where she stands in the hierarchy. And guess what? Those trailing sleeves completely useless. They drag through mud catch on doorways and pose a fire hazard during feast days. But they are dramatic, and in medieval fashion, drama is currency. Historians still argue whether noble women had real agency in choosing their clothing, or if they were merely walking mannequins dressed by fathers and husbands. Truth probably a little of both, but those outfits, they said things about lineage, dowries, alliances, about survival in a world where your clothing might speak louder than your voice. A dog barks from behind a fence and jolts you from your reverie. You glance down at your own sleeves, not dramatic, not even clean, but warm, mostly. You keep walking your boots, squelching through another puddle, and remember that for many fashion wasn't about beauty, it was about bluffing. Look rich enough, and you might avoid taxes. Look respectable enough, and you might dodge judgment. Look busy enough, and people might leave you alone. You pass a servant lugging a bucket of water, the hem of his tunic tucked into his belt to stay dry. You nod. He nods. A quiet code of practicality soaked in mud and unspoken understanding. Back in the village, the day begins to wind down. Fires are being lit. Wool is being folded. Hose are being peeled off like second skins. And through it all, you sense the rhythm of a world stitched together with thread class and a whole lot of guesswork. You find yourself wondering how many people judged you today for your frayed edges, your missing button, your slightly mismatched dye. But here's the thing, they judged everyone. That was the point. Clothing wasn't just about expression, it was surveillance. And somehow, still, you love it. You wake up to the smell of smoke and boiled cabbage, not exactly the medieval perfume of dreams, but comfort in its own rustic way. The fire in your hearth has gone to embers overnight, and your woolen blanket did little to keep the chill from nibbling at your toes. You sit up, pull on a stiff tunic and cinch it with a corded belt that's older than you are. There's a hole near the hem patched with a piece of old tablecloth. If medieval fashion had a motto, it would be function over fab, unless you're rich. You head out to fetch water, passing your neighbour Maud, who is already churning butter. Her kirtle is stained with milk, sleeves rolled up past the elbow hair, tucked under a white coif that's seen better days. She grins, toothless but proud, and you grin back. Her apron has been mended so many times it looks more like a quilt. Still, it works. That's the thing about medieval peasant wear, it wasn't made to impress. It was made to endure. Here's your history. Nugget linen was the base layer for nearly everyone. You wore it under your tunic, under your dress, under your armour, if you were lucky enough to wear armour. It absorbed sweat, which meant you could occasionally wash it, sparing your outer garments from ruin. Sometimes, maybe. Laundry in the Middle Ages was complicated, and usually done in rivers. And now, for your quirky tidbit of the day, some medieval people believed that wearing red warded off illness. Others just liked how it looked with their skin tone. Either way, you occasionally see folks swanning around in faded crimson, looking like a walking chili pepper ready to fight plague and poor taste at once. As you step into the common path that runs through the village, you pass a cart stuck in the mud. A young man is trying to push it free, and his hose, those infamous medieval tights, have split at the inner seam. He shrugs. You shrug. No shame left in this world of exposed knees and permanent embarrassment. Hose, for the record, were originally 2 separate leggings tied to a belt or to your underclothes. Eventually they were stitched together into a single unit think leggings, meet jumpsuit, but with more public indecency risk if the stitching fails. Historians still argue whether this evolution was about fashion modesty or sheer winter survival. Maybe all 3. You help with the cart boots, squelching into the muck tunic, rising dangerously close to a wardrobe malfunction. It's a good reminder, medieval clothes weren't made for Instagram. They were made for survival, often begrudgingly. Further down the road, you see a woman carrying firewood in her arms. She wears a brown wool overdress with a faded blue linen shift underneath. Her headscarf is wound tightly and tucked behind her ears. She glances at the sky like she's hoping for a weather miracle. Her cheeks are smudged with ash. There's something beautiful about her, the quiet dignity, the defiance of fabric that doesn't quite keep the wind out. You pass a wooden sign nailed to a post. The ink is smeared, the letters jagged. It reads something about taxes or tithes or both. And just like that, you remember that medieval fashion wasn't just influenced by weather or function, it was influenced by law. Enter the sumptuary laws. These were legal rules telling people what they could or couldn't wear based on class. If you were a peasant, don't even think about silk. If you were a merchant, maybe you could swing some dyed wool, but only certain colours. Nobles got to wear ermine and gold thread. Everyone else stick to the drab stuff or risk a fine, or worse. Historians still debate whether sumptuary laws were actually enforced consistently or were more like vague threats to keep people in line. But the intent was clear. Clothing was a visual system of control. You spot a boy herding sheep nearby, his cloak flapping behind him like a flag of defiance. It's too big, clearly made for an adult, and he's tripping over the hem every few steps. But it's warm, and it smells like the family hearth, and probably soup. He stops to wave at you, and you wave back laughing as he loses a boot to the mud. That's the thing about medieval rural life. No one expects fashion to be clean. Just stitched, just intact, just warm enough. As you make your way back home, the village comes alive around you. Someone is grinding grain. A child is chasing a goose in circles, both of them shrieking. A man hauls a broken chair into the open air and begins mending it with twine, all of them dressed in layers of practical necessity brown-grey ochre and the occasional blue which was shockingly trendy for something derived from fermented urine. Yes, that's your bonus fringe tidbit. Woad, the plant used to dye cloth blue, required a fermentation process that often smelled like death and dirty socks combined. But the result? A rich, earthy indigo. Totally worth the nasal trauma. As you reach your doorway, you glance down at yourself. Wool tunic, linen shift, hose that feel like betrayal, a belt that might also work as a dog leash in a pinch. You're not fashionable, but you're functional, which, in this time and place, is the gold standard. You duck inside and hang your cloak near the fire. The embers crackle softly. Your mother is darning a sock near the window, humming a tune that sounds like it's been passed down for 6 generations. You settle onto the bench beside her, unlace your boots and stretch your toes toward the warmth. There's something ancient and anchoring about the ritual of clothing in this world. You wrap, layer, tie, adjust. Every day. It may not be flattering, but it's yours. Yours to mend. Yours to wear. Yours to share someday with someone smaller. Because in this world, fashion isn't fleeting. It's inherited. You're back in the small stone cottage adjusting your belt again. It's always either too tight or so loose that your pouch starts thumping against your hip like an impatient squirrel. You duck under a drying rack of laundry, lifting a damp linen shift out of your way with 2 fingers. It smells vaguely of lye and regret. Outside, a rooster screams like it just remembered it was alive. Welcome to the 14th century. As you peel off your outer tunic to let your skin breathe a bit, you take a moment to appreciate the textile miracle of wool. Scratchy, yes. Occasionally full of surprises, bugs, twigs someone else is stitching, but warm. The way medieval wool traps heat even when wet feels like nature's apology for the constant cold. You can thank the sheep, really, and the people who carded, spun, dyed, and wove it by hand. That's hours of labour wrapped around your body, whether it looks good or not. Here's a mainstream historical fact to chew on while you fold your sleeves in many parts of medieval Europe. Spinning thread was so time-consuming that it was considered an almost sacred feminine duty. That's where the term spinster comes from, originally a respectable title for unmarried women who spun for a living. Over time, the dignity got lost, but the word stuck. Your sister appears barefoot with twigs in her hair and a daisy in her teeth. She twirls in a patched-up overdress that might have been blue once, but now hovers somewhere between sky and mud. "Do I look like a noble woman?" she asks. You nod solemnly. The finest lady at the sheepfold. She beams like you've just handed her a crown. And speaking of nobility, let's shift the focus to what the rich were wearing while you were pulling goose feathers out of your sleeves. High fashion in the Middle Ages was wild. Picture enormous sleeves that brushed the floor, pointy shoes long enough to trip over, and hats that looked like scaffolding for small birds. Fashion wasn't just a matter of taste, it was performance art with a budget. There's this bizarre headpiece called the hennin. It looks like a traffic cone balanced on a woman's head, usually covered in gauzy fabric floating behind like a bridal ghost. Historians still argue whether these extreme styles were meant to display wealth, virtue, or just make it harder to go through doorways without bowing. You can't help but chuckle at the image Lady Beatrice tottering across the courtyard, her hennin caught in a tree branch, swearing under her breath like a dock worker, all because someone said it made her look pious. Your mother calls you over to help twist a skein of newly dyed yarn. The bowl of dye beside her smells like rotting cabbage, and copper coins are madder root. If you ever wonder how medieval people got those brilliant reds and oranges, it's through a combination of roots, minerals, urine, and blind faith. Some recipes read like potions, others actually were potions, or at least smelled like them. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval dyers used pigeon droppings to fix colour in cloth. The ammonia in the droppings helped bind pigment to fibres. So, yes, if you were wearing a particularly vibrant tunic, you were probably broadcasting. I spent hours under a coupe for this. You finish the yarn hands stained faintly pink and step back to admire the shelf of threads. Every shade from pale oat to deep walnut tells a story of plants harvested of pots tended of boiling afternoons over smoky fires. Colour in this world is never passive. It's work, it's choice, it's status. Outside, a commotion rises near the well. You peek out and see a travelling merchant showing off a length of silk, real silk, the kind that shimmers even in cloudy daylight. Everyone gathers mouths agape, reaching out to touch it like it's holy. The merchant grins, already planning his price hike. You step closer. The silk is almost sinfully soft, dyed a deep pomegranate red. There's a reason silk was called the cloth of kings. It had to be imported all the way from China, often traded, along dangerous routes, bartered and bribed across continents. In most villages, seeing silk was like spotting a dragon. You didn't question it. You just stared. Historians still debate how widely silk circulated among commoners. Some argue it was rare and precious, reserved for church vestments and elite tunics. Others believe scraps and trims made their way down, sewn into headbands or cuffs like medieval dupes of designer fashion. You imagine sewing a patch of that silk into your sleeve. Just a little shimmer. Just a whisper of luxury amid the wool and dust. Would anyone notice? Would they care? Probably not. But maybe you'd care, and sometimes that's enough. As you walk away, you hear someone mutter about sin and vanity and the dangers of silken pride. You roll your eyes. Every village has a textile moralist. Back home, you re-drape your outer tunic over your shoulders and fasten it with a plain bone brooch. No shiny brass, no gem-encrusted pins like the ones you've heard about in ballads. But it works. It keeps the chill from gnawing at your collarbones. Sometimes survival is the only statement you need. Later, as dusk folds across the village, you sit by the fire and mend a tear in your sleeve. Each stitch is a tiny anchor against unravelling literal and figurative. Your grandmother used to say that clothing holds memory, every patch a story, every seam a prayer. And you believe it, because when you wear something day after day, season after season, across births and funerals, fields and festivals, it stops being just fabric. It becomes you. The fire crackles low as you lean in closer, squinting at the hem of your tunic by candlelight. You've done this so many times, your hands work on autopilot, needle in, needle out, pull tight. It's not glamorous, but then again, nothing about medieval life really is. You wear your clothes until they fall apart, and then you wear them a little longer just to prove a point. This particular hem is fraying at the edge where it always catches on the stool leg. You sigh. One more patch and it'll look like a quilt made by someone with commitment issues. Still, it's your tunic. It fits. It's warm. And that counts for something. Outside, the night wind howls through the trees like it's narrating a tragedy. You imagine it whipping around the castle walls nearby, rustling the banners of lords and ladies who wear velvet slippers indoors and change outfits between courses. Must be nice. Speaking of castles, let's peek inside. One, shall we? Picture this, a grand hall lit by hundreds of beeswax candles, tapestries covering stone walls to keep out the chill, and a nobleman in a tunic so fine it practically glows. His sleeves trail to the floor, stitched with gold thread. His belt buckle could double as a murder weapon. He's the fashion icon of the moment, and he knows it. Mainstream history tells us that by the 14th century, noble fashion had become a full-time job. Sumptuary laws were passed to stop people from dressing above their station. That's right, there were literal laws about looking too fancy, because heaven forbid a well-dressed baker get mistaken for a minor baron. Chaos. You stretch your legs and remember a time when you dared to sew a bit of dyed trim into your neckline. Just a splash of blue, hardly scandalous. But your aunt gasped like you'd walked into church wearing devil horns. Too much, she'd muttered. Too proud. Pride in your village is measured in stitches and silences. Wear something too new and you're showing off. Wear something too old and you're pitiful. It's a tightrope you've been walking since childhood, with a hem in one hand and shame in the other. Let's pivot to a quirky tidbit. Did you know some medieval shoes were so long and pointed that nobles had to tie the tips to their knees to walk? These were called poulaines, and while they looked like elf shoes designed by a maniac, they were all the rage among Europe's upper crust. Some even had bells sewn into the tips, presumably so you could jingle as you strutted through the feasting hall like a one-man carnival. Historians still argue whether poulaines were practical, fashionable, or a deeply committed prank that got out of hand. Regardless, you wouldn't last a second in the mud of your village in those things. Not unless you wanted to be dragged into the nearest ditch for being ridiculous. You glance at your feet, bare and calloused, resting on the hearthstones. No bells, no curls, just skin dirt and the occasional splinter. You smile faintly. At least you won't trip over your own status symbol. Your younger brother stumbles in holding a clump of wool he's clearly supposed to card. Mum says you need to hurry, he mumbles already, halfway to stealing your spot by the fire. You nod and tuck your sewing away. Work never really ends here. It just changes outfits. In the loft, you climb onto a hay-stuffed mattress that creaks like a 1,000-year-old tree. The blanket is heavy, scratchy, and smells of sheep. You nestle into it anyway because warmth is warmth even if it itches. As you drift towards sleep, you think about how every piece of clothing tells a story, not just of who you are, but who you're allowed to be. A tear, a patch, a dye line. These aren't just flaws. They're footnotes in your autobiography. Once a merchant came through the village selling scraps of silk and velvet, tiny pieces no bigger than a handkerchief. He called them dream cloths. You hold it, he said, and you dream of something better. Most people laughed him off. You bought one. It's still tucked under your mattress, a strip of indigo velvet frayed at the edge. You don't look at it often, but you don't throw it away either. Because deep down you believe that one day someone will wear something beautiful and not be punished for it. And maybe, just maybe, that someone will be your child. The rooster isn't even awake yet, but your eyes snap open. Cold air slices across your face, while the rest of you hides beneath the wool blanket. You hold still listening. A rat scuttles behind the wattle and daub wall. Your father clears his throat downstairs, and your mother already moving, always moving. You roll out of bed with the grace of someone whose back was moulded by hay, and years of pretending that pain is just another chore. You dress in layers, starting with a linen shift that's been patched more times than you can count. Over that, a worn kirtle, then an apron that's stained in every shade of the day before. Outside, the sun hasn't bothered to rise yet, but you have. You step into clogs, grab the water bucket, and brace yourself for the walk to the well. The hem of your dress drags through frost-bitten dirt, dampening the fabric that's already whispering its last threads. Let's talk practicality for a moment. Medieval clothes, especially for the working class, weren't about flair, they were about survival. Wool was the go-to, it repelled water, held warmth, and could be spun from the sheep chewing the grass 10 feet from your doorstep. You could dye it, felt it, patch it, even wear it until it almost became skin. And many did. But practicality didn't always mean simplicity. In fact, even peasants took pride in small touches. Coloured thread at the cuffs, a wooden brooch carved by your brother, laces made from braided flax. The creativity wasn't in opulence, it was in necessity. You made do, and you made it your own. Still, historians debate just how uniform these clothes really were. Some argue that working-class attire varied widely between villages and regions shaped by climate trade and community traditions. Others insist that nearly every peasant looked like a brown smear in a field of green. Truth probably somewhere in the muddy middle. You reach the well and wince as the icy rope burns your palms. The bucket drops with a splash, then groans back up heavy with tomorrow's tea and tonight's hand-washing. You balance it against your hip and start back home, trying not to think about how heavy it feels, or how much heavier you feel. Back inside, the fire's crackle is a minor miracle. You crouch low, spreading your fingers toward the embers. Your brother yawns behind you, wearing a tunic so long it doubles as a nightgown. Your mother is wringing water from a rag, already wiping down the table. No one talks. Talking is for people who finish the day. You're still at the starting line. While peeling onions for stew, your thoughts drift to nobility again. Did they ever smell like this? Like smoke and turnips and feet? Probably not. They had perfume, or at least rosewater. You have soap made from ashes and lard. It works technically. But you still wouldn't trust it on a first date. And speaking of noble scents, here's a strange fact for you. During certain eras, wealthy folks thought that bathing too often could weaken the body. Instead, they'd layer fragrant powders and linen to protect themselves. One famous lady allegedly wore the same dress for a month, swapping only the perfumed pads under her armpits. Hygiene optional, appearances mandatory. You scrape onion skins into a clay bowl and wonder what it must feel like to wear something new. Not mended, not borrowed, not found in a ditch and cleaned up good as new. Truly new. Would it make you walk differently? Would people look at you the same? Your aunt used to say, "A hemline tells a story your mouth never dares." You never asked her what that meant, but you think you know, because clothes in this world are loud even when they're silent. A too tight bodice says you've grown. A torn sleeve says you fought. A missing shoe says you're not moving fast enough to matter. And still, every morning you dress with care, even if the fabric is threadbare, even if no one sees, because how you clothe yourself is how you prepare to survive. Later that day, the village square hums with movement. A peddler is showing off ribbons dyed in hues you've only seen in sunset, ochre saffron, even a strange purplish blue. He holds up a length and shouts, "Fit for a duchess, but priced for a dreamer." You step closer, fingers twitching, but your mother grabs your wrist and mutters, "We need salt, not stories." And just like that, the colour is gone. Still the image lingers. In your mind you wear it. A sash fluttering as you walk. No holes, no patches, just beauty. That night, as the fire dies low and the house settles into its nighttime quiet, you press your hand to your apron. Rough wool. Solid. Enough. But your dreams, they wear ribbons. You wake to the sound of geese arguing outside the window, or rather the hole where a window should be. There's fabric nailed over it now, thick linen soaked in lye, but it doesn't do much to keep out the cold or the honking. You groan softly and rub your eyes, the crust of sleep still clinging to the corners. As you sit up, you notice a loose thread hanging from your sleeve. You pull it absent-mindedly, and of course it unravels more than it should. Now the seam is gaping. You sigh. Another repair. Add it to the list. Today is wash day. That means scrubbing until your knuckles are raw, and your back screams louder than the town crier. But first clothes. You dig through the chest and pull out the same kirtle you wore 3 days ago. You give it a sniff, acceptable. Barely. You toss it on and lace the bodice tight, the coarse wool scratching against your shift. The colour, once a gentle olive, has faded to something like pond water after a storm. You smooth the wrinkles and hope the neighbours don't judge too harshly. Then again, they're just as grimy. You bundle up the laundry, mostly shift stockings and a few tunics, and head for the stream. It's still early and the mist hovers over the grass like a held breath. The water's cold, bone-deep cold. You kneel by the edge and start scrubbing. The soap's harsh. Made from animal fat and ashes, it stings every crack on your hands, but it does the job. As you beat a tunic against the rock, you think about how few clothes you actually own. 3 outfits if you're lucky. 1 for work, 1 for church, and 1 you pretend is nice. Everything else is patchwork. Not in the trendy post-apocalyptic fashion sense. No, this is survival stitching. The knee of your hose has a square of old curtain. Your best apron once belonged to your aunt, and you've never unpicked her initials. Historians agree that most medieval folks had very little in the way of clothing. Fabric was expensive, and making garments was labour-intensive. Even the simplest tunic might take days to sew by hand, and that's assuming you already had the wool, the tools, and the time, which you never do. But here's the curious part. Despite the scarcity, people were obsessed with appearance. Laws were written to regulate what you could wear based on your class. Sumptuary laws, they were called. And they weren't just about fabric, they covered colours, furs, embroidery, and even how pointy your shoes could be. Seriously. Too pointy, and the guards might literally cut them off your feet. One of the quirkiest laws, a rule in 14th century England, stated that no one under the rank of knight could wear silk, and yet people did anyway. Silk smuggling was a thing. Can you imagine risking jail time just to wear a shiny scarf? Humans have always been a little ridiculous. You wring out the final piece of laundry and drape it over a bush to dry. The sun's creeping higher now, and you feel the faintest warmth on your neck. Your fingers are stiff and red and your arms ache. But there's something meditative about it. The repetition, the rhythm, the knowledge that you're doing exactly what your grandmother did and her grandmother before her. On the walk back, you pass a woman wearing what might generously be called a fashion statement sleeves, so long they drag behind her dyed a faint blue and trimmed in what you suspect is fur. It's probably rabbit. Might have been white once. She walks with her chin high like the mud can't reach her hem. You smirk, but you're also a little jealous. Back home you hang the damp clothes near the fire. The smell of wool drying is oddly comforting. Your mother is stirring a pot of barley stew, the scent earthy and warm. You peel carrots while your sister hums an off-key tune about a goose that laid diamonds. The floor creaks under your feet. The dog sighs in his sleep. Your father walks in soaked from chopping wood and shakes his boots at the threshold. You pass him the dry shirt still warm from the fire. He nods his thanks and slips it on with a grunt of relief. In that moment, you realise clothes matter, not just as protection or status symbols, but as extensions of the self. The shirt you patched for your father, that's love. The apron your sister wears, that's training for the future. The shift you scrubbed until your skin bled, that's pride. Quiet, durable pride. Later, as dusk rolls in and shadows stretch across the walls, you finally sit, just for a moment, your feet tucked beneath you, your hands still damp. The fire crackles and spits and you lean into its glow. You're still in your work clothes, still smell like lye and smoke, but the fabric feels softer now, broken in, familiar. It holds your shape, your scent, your story. You may not own silk, or embroidery, or those ridiculous pointy shoes, but you've got something better, a life stitched together one seam at a time. You wake with the faint memory of a dream, something about dancing in a hall lit by beeswax candles, wearing a gown that shimmered like moonlight. But the fantasy fades fast, chased away by the unmistakable itch of wool and the weight of yet another scratchy layer. Because today, like every day, you have to get dressed in the strangest looking garments imaginable, at least by modern standards. You pull on your chemise first. It's linen, of course. Everything close to the skin has to be linen because wool itches, like it holds a grudge. But even linen in this age isn't soft like the kind you'd find in a boutique. It's rough thick and has the grace of a flour sack. It reaches your ankles and your wrists and has absolutely no shape. Then comes the kirtle. This is the real foundation of your outfit, a sort of medieval bodycon dress, except you're lacing yourself into it using side ties, or maybe a front panel with spiraled cords. It's wool dyed in dull plant-based colours like madder red or woad blue. The sleeves are tight, very tight. You've had to wiggle your arm in like threading a needle before. Your hair, meanwhile, must not be seen. You're a decent woman after all. So you wrap it under a linen coif, then maybe a veil or wimple over that. There goes your neck, your ears, your hairline, all tucked away, as though virtue lived in follicles. Historians still argue whether hair covering was strictly enforced, or more about regional and class norms, but you don't take chances. Now, the overdress. Maybe it's a surcoat with open sides, great for showing off your nice kirtle underneath, and also for flaunting the curve of your hips. You know if you're scandalous. These were once called windows of hell, by the way. That's right, fashion has always been dramatic. And shoes. If you're lucky, you have a pair of turn shoes made of leather shaped like soft slippers. No left or right, just foot-shaped approximations. If it's winter, you stuff straw inside. No arch support, no laces, just vibes and vegetable-tanned leather. You might even slip on Patton's wooden platforms strapped to your feet to keep the mud off your actual shoes. It's like walking on tiny sleds. And yes, you fall. Everyone does. It's a rite of passage like losing a tooth or boiling cabbage without ruining your only pot. Then there's the belt. A long strip of leather or braided fabric looped low over your hips sometimes, with a pouch attached. No pockets, remember? Women wouldn't get those for several more centuries. If you're highborn, maybe you tuck a key into the belt too to show you run a household. If you're not, you just hope no one steals your only spoon. One mainstream historical fact about all this clothes was status. Every colour, every trim, every fabric choice sent a message. Deep blue, that's expensive dye. Fur lining, you're wealthy. Sumptuary laws even tried to enforce who could wear what. In England, only nobility could wear ermine, and certain silks were off limits unless you had the right bloodline. Imagine being fined for wearing the wrong shade of green, because that happened. And here's your quirky tidbit. Medieval buttons weren't for utility. They were decorative, especially on sleeves. Real fasteners were ties, pins, or lacing. So if your sleeve had 30 tiny buttons, it was for the drama, not the convenience. You'd still need help getting dressed unless you had the flexibility of a contortionist monk. By the time you're fully dressed, you're exhausted. Layer upon layer. Scratch upon itch. But you're also ready. Because in this world, clothing isn't just about warmth, it's identity, it's protection, it's your armour, your social badge, your second skin, even if it smells faintly of sheep. You're watching a tailor's apprentice dart around a smoky workshop barefoot on the straw-strewn floor, holding up a woolen hose that looks more like a limp sock than an article of fashion. His master, a wide man with a permanently furrowed brow, shakes his head and mutters about gussets and gauze. You don't know what any of those are, but it's clear they matter. In medieval tailoring, every inch of fabric is precious, and every mistake costs more than thread. It costs reputation, maybe even a client. Because believe it or not, fashion was big business, for those who could afford to play. The 14th century is when clothes start shifting from something you need not to freeze to something that says who you are. Tailors rise in prominence, and with them their secrets. Cutting fabric on the bias to achieve drape. Shaping tunics with curved seams, using lacing and buttons, not just for function but to sculpt the body. For the first time, your clothes don't just fit, they flatter. Well, ideally. Sometimes they just kind of bunch awkwardly around the thighs, but hey, that's part of the charm. Mainstream historians agree this is the birth of the fashion industry, small though it is. Wealthy households hire full-time dressmakers. Guilds form complete with regulations on who can stitch what and for whom. There's even a debate over who gets to wear which colour of lining. Your social rank literally dictates the shade of your undercoat. It's as if Target had a royal blue you legally couldn't buy, unless your great-grandfather owned a castle. Buttons, by the way, are all the rage. Not just a few on your cuffs, dozens, sometimes hundreds, marching down sleeves, bodices, even the backs of gowns. And no zippers in sight, obviously, which means someone else has to help you get dressed. Romantic, maybe. Inconvenient, definitely. There's even speculation that some nobles intentionally designed their outfits to require assistance just to show off how many servants they had. Historians still argue whether this was a conscious power move or just a side effect of very bad ergonomics. Meanwhile, you've got sumptuary laws cropping up like dandelions. For those unfamiliar, that's a fancy term for government-approved fashion policing. No one below the rank of knight may wear fur of a certain kind. No silks for anyone under a baron. Peasants caught wearing too much velvet could be fined or worse, publicly shamed. These laws aren't always enforced, but they linger like a passive-aggressive dress code from the king. On the fringe side of things, some tailors develop secret patterns they guard like dragon hoards. Others claim their measuring strings are blessed by saints to guarantee perfect fit. There's even a belief among some villagers that certain colours can ward off illness, or if you choose wrong, attract the devil. One ill-fated bride in a northern parish wore green was struck by fever, and gave rise to a saying, "He who weds in leaf shall soon wear grief." You wonder what kind of fashion drama happens in court. Spoiler, it's brutal. There's a documented case of a noble woman being exiled not for treason, but for outdressing the queen at a feast. She wore an imported brocade from Venice with so much gold thread that the candlelight made her glow like an apparition. The queen did not appreciate being out-illuminated. And then there are the men. Doublets get tighter, sleeves get puffier, and codpieces. Well, we're getting there. But for now, let's just say fashion is no longer just functional. It's theatrical, symbolic, often uncomfortable, and always, always political. You return to that workshop one more time. The apprentice is now poking holes into a thick blue velvet, preparing to stitch pearls into the hem. His fingers are clumsy, but his face is focused. He knows this gown isn't just clothing, it's currency. If it impresses his master might finally trust him with more than hose and hoods. If it fails, it'll be unravelled and repurposed, and so will he. Outside, the wind lifts a torn banner from the Guildhall. It reads Per Fabricam Gloria through craft glory. The letters are faded, but the message still holds. In this world, a well-cut sleeve might be the difference between obscurity and status, between shame and security, between a peasant's rags and a prince's regard. You find yourself trudging through a cold morning fog, ducking into the stone archway of a town square already teeming with colour. But it's not the produce or the pigs or the potter's wares that catch your eye. It's the parade of pointed shoes, jewelled hoods and garments so tight they seem to defy physics. Welcome to the height of fashion absurdity, the age of the poulaines. If you're not familiar with poulaines, you're in for a treat and maybe a stubbed toe. These were shoes with impossibly long pointed toes, some extending well past the foot like tiny fabric canoes. They were stuffed with moss or horsehair to hold their shape and occasionally tied up with laces to the wearer's shin. Why? Because practicality is for farmers, and you sir or madam are here to impress. Historians still argue whether poulaines originated in Poland, hence the name, or were simply popularised there before sweeping across Western Europe faster than a market rumour. Regardless, they quickly became a status symbol. A commoner's shoe might have a modest point, just a little flare. A nobleman's could be over 2 feet long, curved like the prow of a Viking ship. One bishop famously declared them an affront to humility, which is maybe the best fashion critique of the 14th century. But the pointy shoes aren't the only thing stretching credibility. Around this time, tunics for men begin to shrink vertically. Hemlines creep higher and higher, until some resemble long shirts. Add a pair of colourful hose and, well, let's just say there's a reason codpieces are about to become necessary. The tightness wasn't just a preference, it was a performance. Showing off one's physique, especially legs, became an unspoken competition in court circles. And speaking of the codpiece, yes, it's starting to make quiet appearances here. Initially, it's just a triangular flap sewn into hose to allow for bathroom breaks. But soon enough, it evolves into something more sculptural and exaggerated. Historians still debate whether this was pure vanity or a result of the fabric limitations of split hose. Either way, the male silhouette changes drastically during this period. You're no longer seeing shapeless robes, you're seeing broad shoulders, narrow waists, and the occasional rather unignorable centerpiece. On the women's side, fashion takes a different turn literally. Gowns begin to swirl into what's called the sideless surcoat, essentially a sleeveless overgown with armholes so large they practically expose the ribs. Worn over a tight-fitting kirtle, this look became popular among noblewomen, partly for elegance, partly for its exaggerated lines. Critics at the time called them windows to hell, which is, you have to admit, a bit much for an armpit. Burgundian court dress especially hits new theatrical heights. Tall hennins, the cone-shaped hats, make their debut veils cascading down like wedding banners. Sleeves balloon to the size of small sailboats. Trains stretch across entire chambers. In portraits, noble women stand stiff as statues weighed down by their elegance, held together by hundreds of pins and the sheer force of will. Fringe fact of the day. In some households, servants had to carry the ends of noblewomen's sleeves or gowns to prevent them from dragging in the mud. And yes, they were paid for it. Just imagine having the job title sleeve bearer. We should bring that back. Meanwhile, tailors, cobblers and milliners are innovating fast, keeping up with aristocratic whim. The best among them gained celebrity status. Some are even offered commissions by royal courts to create entire seasonal wardrobes. That's right, fashion seasons existed long before fashion weeks in Paris. Just instead of paparazzi, you had woodcuts. And instead of Anna Wintour, there was a bishop judging you from the pulpit. But not everyone's impressed. Preachers rail against vanity, blaming elaborate clothes for droughts, plagues, and the decline of morality. One monk writes an entire sermon comparing poulain wearers to demons with snouts. Another claims God flooded a town in France after a nobleman commissioned hose with gold stitching. To be fair, that's not even the strangest thing blamed on clothes. In some regions, people believed tight garments could cause infertility or madness. And yet, here in this muddy square, fashion keeps evolving. The poor copy the rich as best they can, dyeing wool with crushed berries, stuffing their shoes with rags to fake the long toe, lacing together scraps into silhouettes that mimic nobility. A merchant's wife tucks a single flower into her veil. A butcher's son tightens the belt on his hand-me-down tunic. Everyone in some small way plays the game. Because strange as it may seem now, fashion wasn't just decoration, it was identity, it was aspiration, it was a little rebellion sewn in seams, a silent declaration, I am more than this dirt underfoot. And so you walk on past the poulaines, poking through puddles, past the trailing velvet gowns, past the sleeves that demand their own chairs at the table. You smile. Because even in the mud and the cold and the clamour of daily life, people found a way to express beauty, absurdity and pride one stitch at a time. You duck behind a cart for a second, trying to dodge the wheel splash from a passing mule, and end up nose to knee with the hem of a nobleman's tunic, so short it borders on scandal. He strides by without noticing, too absorbed in adjusting his feathered cap and making sure his matching gloves show. Welcome to the age when colour-matching fur lining and sumptuary laws ruled what you could wear, often literally. By this point in the medieval wardrobe saga, clothing isn't just a personal statement, it's a legal one. If you're wondering whether a peasant could just save up and splurge on some crimson velvet, the answer is not, if he likes staying out of trouble. Sumptuary laws passed all across Europe from the 13th century onward dictated exactly who could wear what. Not just fabrics and colours, but trimmings, accessories, even sleeve widths. And yes, people were fined, or worse, for breaking these rules. You wear what you're allowed to wear. Scarlet is for nobility. Fur-lined collars are for those with titles. Only the upper crust can don cloth of gold or silks from the east. That deep, rich indigo imported and wildly expensive commoners can look but not touch. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced strictly or used more as guidelines, but the symbolism mattered. Clothing was your badge, your billboard with sleeves so wide a goose could sleep in them. What's ironic is that many of these laws were created because lower classes were getting too fashionable. Rising merchants, craftsmen, and even well-paid servants started dressing like minor nobility, blurring the visual hierarchy. This apparently could not stand. Heaven forbid a wealthy merchant be mistaken for a baron. Next thing you know, the sheep would be voting. There's one recorded case from Florence in the late 14th century, where a baker's wife was fined for wearing ermine-lined cuffs too luxurious for her station, said the ruling. She argued they were fake. The court still made her pay. A lesson perhaps in not outdressing your neighbours when your neighbours write the laws. Still, fashion finds a way. That's the fringe fact this time. People got creative. Tailors developed techniques to simulate richer fabrics using embroidery, patchwork and layered dyes. Poorer townsfolk might edge their cloaks with leftover brocade scraps or embroider imitation gold thread with clever plant-based dyes. One woman in Ghent reportedly wore a gown with a painted-on jewelled collar for church and fooled several priests. Your own outfit today. Let's be honest, it's seen better days. Your hose don't match because the dog chewed one. The tunic has a grease stain you've been telling people is tanning oil, but still you try. Everyone does. The urge to look good, to look like someone remains even under mud and linen. Meanwhile, at court things are getting even more intense. Enter the houppelande. Think high collars, massive bell sleeves and fabric folds for days. Originally unisex, but eventually adopted more famously by men. The wealthy love them for their grandeur and flow. They're often lined with fur and so long they drag across castle floors. Tailors start charging extra by the yard, which you can only imagine led to some very ambitious fashion statements and some very tired servants. You see a young lord swanning by in one now, the hem of his houppelande wet with early morning dew. A golden girdle. Yes, that's a fancy medieval belt is cinched over the layers, pushing the fabric into elegant pleats. He looks like he's melting backward into velvet, and he knows it. But this isn't just about vanity. It's also about warmth. Castles are cold, especially the stone ones in northern Europe. Thick fabrics, layered sleeves, and heavy cloaks serve a very practical purpose. When your fireplace is the size of a bookshelf, and your windows are basically holes. Fashion often doubled as insulation. Historians still argue whether the extravagance of garments like the houppelande was born more of necessity than trend-setting. You glance down at your own frayed cloak patched 3 times at the hem. The breeze sneaks in uninvited. Wouldn't mind a fur lining yourself, you think not that you'll ever afford it. But again, you do what you can. Everyone does. And then you spot a bit of clever tailoring. A young woman in the market wears a double-layered coif that's been stiffened into shape, probably using boiled linen or fish glue. It frames her face beautifully, a sort of poor woman's hennin. Her tunic is cinched just right, the belt looped low to elongate the body. She probably stitched it herself. That's the real power of fashion subversion through stitching, a silent kind of resistance sewn into every borrowed thread. The joke for today: a tailor, a monk and a goose walk into a tavern. Only one comes out with sleeves still attached. As the sun rises higher, colours begin to show their true hue. Reds deepen, greens mellow, and the finer fabrics shimmer faintly. There's beauty here even amidst the mud, the gossip and the regulation. Because people didn't just want to survive, they wanted to shine. Even if that meant sneaking a strip of silk into a hem or painting fake gems onto a hat. And you keep walking amused by the thought that in a world where nothing is certain, not bread, not health, not safety, people still choose to decorate themselves, to put on their best and walk tall. Maybe that's not just fashion, maybe that's hope. You find yourself stuck behind a wagon loaded with beets trying not to trip on the rutted path when a woman breezes by wearing what looks like an actual building on her head. Okay, not quite a building, but close. It's a towering hennin, the cone-shaped headpiece you've probably seen in fairy tale illustrations, and yes, people really wore them. Tonight, we dive perhaps literally into medieval headwear, because if clothing was meant to show your class, your honour, your piety and your fashion sense, then your hat. Your hat did all that, and made sure people noticed you from across the town square. The hennin was one of the most iconic and absurd inventions of 15th century fashion. These conical headdresses, often worn by noble women, could range from subtle peaks to soaring towers over 2 feet high. Sometimes they had veils trailing from the tip like a medieval comet tail. Sometimes they were double cones. Sometimes they were heart-shaped, because why not wear your silhouette like a Valentine's Day card? Historians still argue whether these were purely ornamental, or if they had some symbolic significance, virginity, marital status, or alignment with the French court. What we do know is that they were wildly impractical. Try walking through a low door with one of those, or leaning down to pick up a runaway chicken. You don't. The fringe fact: at one point these hats were so tall and gravity-defying that people started using wire cages, padded rolls, and even hardened starch to keep them upright. There's a legend of a woman whose hennin got caught in a church chandelier and took the whole candelabra down with her. Candlelit chaos. And the hennin wasn't alone in the headgear madness. Men had their own fashion battles above the eyebrows. Enter the chaperone, not the person, the hat. It started as a hood with a long tail called a liripipe, because medieval people had fun with words, but over time it became more of a fashion accessory than a weather shield. Picture this. You wrap the face hole of your hood around your head, like a turban, drape the tail over your shoulder like a scarf, and tie the cape in an elaborate knot. Congratulations, you now have a chaperone and also possibly a neck cramp. The fun thing about medieval hats is that they weren't just decoration, they were a language. Wide brims might suggest travel or working outdoors. Flat caps could hint at middle-class respectability. A veil over a wimple meant modesty and often age or widowhood. There were sumptuary laws here too, of course. God forbid a tanner dressed like a clerk, but people always found ways to stretch the rules. If not the law, then at least the fabric. You spot a young man with his hat tipped just so, probably to show off his thick hair, which he clearly loves more than food. His chaperone is slung fashionably low, and he has the smug look of someone who knows he's pulling it off. His hose are matched, his sleeves are tight. He's the medieval equivalent of someone who accidentally takes selfies in good lighting. Then there's the friar, trudging past, bald and smiling with his hood neatly folded back. His outfit is simple, almost plain. No embellishments, no fanciful hats. Just the idea that dignity doesn't need embroidery. Or maybe he just hates getting poked in the eye by feathers. Let's not forget the coif, a tight-fitting linen cap usually tied under the chin. Worn by both men and women, especially under larger hats, it was practical and modest. Perfect for keeping lice out and hair in. Some knights even wore quilted versions under their helmets, and children almost always wore them. Probably so they wouldn't wander off and stick forks into candle flames, but also because coifs were warm and washable. Modern side note, If you think beanies are a modern invention, you've clearly never met a 14th century peasant baby in a coif. Same energy, fewer synthetic fibres. You glance up at the village green and see two older women sitting near the well, their heads wrapped in layers of veils. Not hennins, those were for the aristocracy, but practical head coverings that still showed care. One adjusts hers carefully before smiling at a passing girl. There's quiet pride in the gesture, a kind of dignity not born from jewels but from knowing exactly how to fold linen into beauty. And then there's the hair. Under all those hats and veils, hair was often braided, coiled and tucked in elaborate ways. Women might plait their locks around padded rolls at the temples, creating heart-shaped silhouettes beneath sheer veils. Men might curl their beards with wax for feast days. Hair itself became an extension of the costume, half hidden, fully crafted. A group of children chase a piglet down the lane, their heads bare and their laughter wild. One boy wears what might have once been a felt cap, now crushed and patched and definitely home-dyed. It's crooked. It's perfect. Hat humour for the knight. A knight, a monk and a merchant argue over whose hat is holiest. The monk says his was blessed. The knight says his deflects arrows. The merchant sells both of theirs and retires early. The truth is, these hats and head coverings weren't just about keeping warm or shading from the sun. They were armour of a different kind, signalling class virtue, wealth and wit. They were the first thing you saw, and often the last thing you judged. They crowned you literally. And as the evening stretches and the wind tugs softly at your own humble coif, you realise even now, centuries later, we still do this. Still dress our heads to express our hearts. Still shape ourselves through fabric and thread. Still reach for identity one fold at a time. You wake the next morning to the low whistle of wind creeping through the cracks of your shutters, the fire reduced to soft embers. Pulling your cloak tight, you rise and begin your morning tasks, but not before noting the faded hemline of your tunic brushing your ankles. That's the thing about medieval clothes, they age with you. And if there's one thing that defines their strangeness, it's not just the colours or shapes, it's how obsessively people manage their length. So today we're talking about sleeves, hems, and the inexplicable medieval obsession with making everything either absurdly long or aggressively short. Let's begin with the sleeves. In the early 1300s, sleeves were practical, long, loose tied at the wrist or elbow. But by the late 14th century, fashion became a game of status-driven inconvenience. Suddenly, the wealthiest folks were trailing sleeves that nearly skimmed the floor. And no, not for wiping down tables. They were often slashed, lined with velvet or embroidered with golden thread. Historians still argue whether these sleeves had ritualistic meaning or were just flashy indicators that the wearer didn't have to work with their hands. One thing's clear, if your sleeves could gather rainwater, you were probably rich. You pass a noblewoman in the market square wearing exactly such sleeves, and as she picks over radishes, she carefully drapes them over her forearm like someone trying not to drag spaghetti through a sauce bowl. They don't make shopping easy, but they do make you look important. And in a world without Instagram, sleeve drama was how you got noticed. Meanwhile, your own tunic is a patchwork of usefulness. It's shorter now than it was last winter thanks to a growth spurt and fraying at the cuffs. You've tried to stitch it up with blue-dyed thread you bartered for, but the shade doesn't match. No one's fooled, but it does the job. Then there's the tunic game among men. There was a glorious, chaotic period in the mid to late 14th century when male tunics, also known as coat hardies, shrunk so aggressively they became fashion punchlines. Picture a nobleman in a doublet so tight it's practically medieval shapewear paired with hose so snug they may as well be painted on. The tunic barely covers anything, just a flutter of fabric over the hips like a fashion shrug. One chronicler at the time wrote that these outfits made men more fit to be dancers than warriors. A light joke perhaps, until you remember that armour still had to go over these. Good luck moving gracefully with a chainmail wedgie. Fringe fact. There was a satirical poem that mocked men whose tunics were so short they couldn't bend over without a full moon sighting. Some towns even passed ordinances banning indecent displays of the buttocks in public. You know you've gone too far when your outfit inspires actual legislation. Of course not. Everyone went the tight and tiny route. There was another camp that opted for long flowing robes. Think scholars, monks, and wealthy merchants, people who wanted to ooze wisdom and importance. Robes were layered, belted, and sometimes adorned with fur at the collar or cuffs. The hemline brushed the floor like a gentle rebuke to the dust. Historians still debate whether robe length was more about climate or class, but one thing's certain: having enough fabric to waist was a visible flex. If you could trip on your own clothing and not care, you were probably doing fine. You see a travelling friar pass by his robe modest, the hem frayed the colour a soft brown faded by countless days under the sun. He walks steadily, his sandals slapping the ground with each step, and you can't help but respect the quiet endurance in his simplicity. He may not look strange by fashion standards, but in a world chasing ornamentation, his humility becomes its own kind of radical. Now let's talk hose. Not the gardening kind. Medieval hose were long stockings worn by men, often in mismatched colours, to make legs look longer, or simply because it was trendy. They were laced to the doublet at the waist, and for a while worn with no covering in between. Yes, that means what you think it means. Eventually, this gave rise to the codpiece, which was basically a decorative patch, sometimes padded, sometimes bejewelled, always deeply unnecessary, meant to cover that revealing gap. Scholars still argue whether codpieces were invented for modesty, armour functionality, or straight-up peacocking. Your guess is probably as good as theirs. Imagine trying to run from a bear with a jewel-studded codpiece flapping around. That's the kind of commitment medieval fashion demanded. The women weren't spared the extremities of tailoring either. Bodices were cinched, gowns were laced so tight you could hear your last meal protest, and trains were long enough to collect neighbourhood gossip. One English sumptuary law actually dictated the maximum length of a gown's train depending on your husband's social rank. The fashion police were real and armed with measuring sticks. You recall Lady Eleanor from the manor house up the hill, whose dress trains have to be carried by a maid during festivals. They sweep the earth like a holy relic, though she once tripped on it during a maypole dance and broke her ankle. Still, she insists on wearing them, because appearances, even when painful, were sacred. And finally, the belt, a deceptively simple accessory that could tell you everything about a person's wealth, gender, and even romantic status. Men wore wide leather belts with ornate buckles, sometimes hanging low over the hips like medieval swagger. Women favoured narrow belts, often with keys dangling from them. A key meant you ran a household. No key, you were probably still under someone else's roof. So yes, clothing length was often either too much or too little, but it was never boring. As you sit by the fire at the end of the day, your tunic drawn around your knees, you think about the choices behind every stitch, the people who stitched it, the messages those lengths once carried. In a world of dirt floors, leaky roofs, and honest work clothing was still something magical, something aspirational. It let you dream a little, even if your sleeves weren't golden and your hemline didn't sweep the earth. Later that week, as you kneel beside a tub of freezing water and scrub your only tunic against a flat stone, you wonder, what did people do before detergent, before washing machines, before socks that didn't smell like medieval despair? The answer lies in one of the lesser discussed wonders of the Middle Ages hygiene, or more specifically, what passed for hygiene, and naturally what that meant for your clothing. You wring out your damp tunic fingers numb and drape it over a low hedge, hoping the sun does its job, because you only have 2 of these, and even that is a luxury. In fact, most peasants owned just 1 to 2 full outfits, rotated, reworn and repaired, until the fabric gave up the ghost. If you ripped a seam, you stitched it. If the elbows wore through, you patched them. If the armpits turned toxic, well, you dealt with it. A mainstream fact linen underclothes were worn closest to the body and washed most often, even if often meant a few times a month. Overclothes like wool tunics or cloaks were rarely washed and often simply aired out in the wind. Wet wool smells a bit like despair and sheep, but hey, people got used to it. Now, here's your quirky tidbit of the day. Medieval folks sometimes beat their clothes with sticks in rivers to drive out dirt. Literal whacking. It's not the kind of gentle cycle we know, but effective in its own blunt way. Soap, when available, was handmade from animal fat, and ash sharp, pungent, and deeply alkaline. It was called lye soap, and could burn your skin if misused. Good luck washing your delicate silks in that. And speaking of silk, you wouldn't even be touching it, unless you were part of the 1%. Silk was imported from the East, and was often more expensive than gold by weight. Worn by royalty, clergy, and high nobility, it shimmered in candlelight and whispered of wealth. But you're here with a burlap apron and a tunic that smells like goat. Still, there's a quiet pride in how clean you try to keep it. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually cared about cleanliness, or whether it was just a religious ritual. Some scholars point to regular bathing customs in bathhouses, particularly in Islamic and Byzantine regions, while others argue that after the Black Death attitudes toward communal washing grew suspicious and bathing fell out of favour. In England and Northern Europe, baths were more occasional, something you did for feast days, or when lice made your scalp feel like it was crawling off your skull. But clothing, that was your armour. Even if it was itchy, faded or sour, it covered your body and signalled your place in the world. You walk through the village common now, passing neighbours, who are all engaged in some form of laundry. A woman with strong arms slaps wool cloaks against a stone. Children hang socks, foot wraps over branches, and an older man carefully plucks lice from the seams of his shirt, humming as he flicks them into the fire. It's an ecosystem of fabric and function. You think about your own routine, turning your tunic inside out every few days, brushing the mud off with stiff straw, hanging it near the smoke so it smells slightly less like despair. You even tried sprinkling crushed lavender on it once until you found out that old Marjorie claimed lavender makes babies come out backward. You haven't touched it since. The neckline of your tunic is fraying again, and you make a mental note to beg your aunt for a few spare threads next week. She used to be a weaver back when her hands were steady. Now she mostly sits near the fire and tells stories about when she could spin flax so fine it felt like spider silk. Which brings us to flax, a miracle crop of the medieval world. Linen made from the fibres of the flax plant was the go-to for undergarments. It breathed, it absorbed, it lasted. If cotton was the quiet luxury of the later centuries, linen was the reliable sibling who always showed up and never made a fuss. But wool was the main event. Warm in winter, itchy in summer, spun thick or thin and dyed with whatever natural pigments you could scrounge. Onion skins for gold, woad for blue, madder root for red, and sometimes, if you were feeling particularly adventurous or unlucky, crushed beetles for a deep burgundy. Colour in medieval clothing was as much about chemistry as it was about flair. Of course, the richer your hue, the higher your status. Bright red was expensive, deep green pricey. Blue was common if made from woad, but brilliant ultramarine derived from lapis lazuli was so costly it was usually reserved for the Virgin Mary in paintings. Your clothes are the soft brown of undyed wool and the dusty grey of use, but you see the wealth of effort in them, the mending, the care, the sheer endurance. And let's not forget the grand irony: the fancier the fabric, the less practical the garment. Noblewomen wore tight-sleeved gowns that required assistance just to put on. Noblemen strutted around in doublets laced so tight you'd think they were holding in secrets. But you can move, bend, work, and breathe. Well, almost breathe. Your tunic's neckline has stretched from years of pulling it over your head, and the shoulders have been let out twice. It's not flattering, but it's yours. And it has survived 4 winters and 2 pregnancies, in this world that's practically couture. And as you sit with your back to the fire that night, clutching your now dry tunic to your chest, you realise strangeness isn't always about appearance. Sometimes it's about the quiet rituals of survival, the daily grind of beating, patching, scrubbing and wearing. You might not look like the illuminated manuscripts in the Abbey, but your clothes carry a story too, one of hands and hardship threads and tenacity. You pull the tunic over your head, feel the familiar scratch of the fabric against your skin and exhale. Tomorrow you'll wear it again. You wake to the sound of birds, or maybe it's just the neighbour's rooster with no sense of personal space. Either way, the sky is still grey, and your blanket, such as it is, barely holds the night chill at bay. You sit up slowly, rubbing one eye, and reach for your shoes. Let's talk about those shoes. If you're lucky, they're made of leather, thick, cracked, stitched by hand, and shaped like soft, deflated loaves of bread. If you're not lucky, you've got cloth wrappings or wooden clogs which make walking a delightful game of will I fall in the mud today or not. Spoiler alert, you probably will. See, medieval footwear wasn't exactly about arch support. Soles were flat. Insulation was a myth. Waterproofing involved animal fat or praying it wouldn't rain. Laces were leather cords, and if one broke, you tied a knot and hoped for the best. In cold months, people stuffed straw inside to stay warm. The straw didn't work, but hey, it made nice rustling sounds. You slip on your shoes and wince as the cold soaks through immediately. They were wet yesterday, and now they're stiff. Still better than bare feet, which you've experienced often enough to know that stepping on a frozen twig at dawn should be listed as a medieval torture technique. Mainstream fact shoes in the Middle Ages varied wildly by class. The nobility had pointed shoes, very pointed shoes, called poulaines, which stretched so far past the toe that some needed to be tied to the wearer's shin. Were they practical? Not at all. But they made quite the fashion statement. The church, of course, hated them. They were denounced as tools of vanity, which in fairness is a pretty accurate description. Here's your quirky tidbit: in some towns laws were passed to limit the length of those shoe tips based on your rank. That's right, your footwear was literally regulated. If you were a knight, you might be allowed a 6-inch toe. A nobleman, maybe 10. A commoner, keep it sensible. Historians still argue whether this was more about maintaining social order or just preventing people from tripping on their own status. As you make your way out to fetch water, stepping carefully over uneven stones and dodging chicken droppings, you wonder who decided shoes should be this way. Was it economics, tradition, peer pressure? Maybe a little of all three. You reach the well, still rubbing sleep from your eyes, and there's old Marjorie again, midwife gossip shoeless. Her feet are like leather themselves, cracked and calloused, but she walks like it's nothing. You can't help but admire that kind of toughness. You nod politely and she grunts something about the cold getting into her knees. You drop the bucket down the well, the rope creaking as it unspools. Water shoes were a thing too, by the way, wooden planks strapped to the bottom of regular shoes to walk through muck. Not elegant, but effective. Sort of like medieval Crocs, but with more splinters. Once the bucket's full, you brace yourself for the heave. Your shoes slip slightly on the wet stone and your back tenses. You wonder not for the first time if this child you're carrying will someday walk on smoother roads. Roads with cobblestones that don't tilt. Or maybe roads paved flat and solid with shoes that don't soak up the world like sponges. Back at home, you pass your father, who's shaping leather with a blunt knife. He doesn't say much, but the pile of rough soles next to him tells you he's working on repairs. He's done it for years, mostly for barter. One pair of mended shoes. Jaish's 2 chickens if the stitching holds. His hands are slow now and the leather's tough, but he keeps going. Because feet don't wait. Inside, your mother is folding strips of linen foot wraps for your younger siblings. Socks weren't common in your household. Instead, feet were wrapped tightly in cloth, changed every few days and dried by the fire when possible. You remember your aunt once saying that a wrapped foot was a happy foot. You're not convinced. As the day wears on, you keep moving, sweeping, feeding, fetching, boiling, and with every step your shoes remind you of their presence. A stone jabs your heel, a seam rubs your ankle. You curse softly under your breath. Your baby kicks in agreement. Later at market, you see a shoemaker's stall. The boots are lined with fur, thick-soled, stitched with waxed thread. You want them more than you want anything else. They look warm, dry, whole, but they also cost more than your family sees in 2 months. So instead, you ask the shoemaker if he's got any scraps. He gives you a small square of leather with a shrug. Maybe you can use it for patching, maybe not. Either way, you thank him and tuck it into your belt. As you head home, you pass a group of children playing in the mud, barefoot, shrieking happy. You smile, then wince. A rock's worked its way into your shoe. Again. And so, the evening comes and you sit by the fire, unlacing your shoes slowly. Your feet are red and raw. You stretch them toward the warmth, watching steam rise from your damp soles. The leather has cracked further, and the stitching near the toe is fraying. But they're yours. Tomorrow you'll wear them again. The fire crackles low, casting dancing shadows along the walls of your one-room home. You wiggle your toes in front of the warmth, grateful for even a few moments of stillness. But the flickering light also casts long reminders of chores, still waiting, of a world that doesn't stop just because your feet hurt. You look around. Your father's asleep with a carving knife still clutched in hand, a half-finished spoon tucked in his lap. Your mother is braiding dried herbs into a bundle to hang above the lintel. She hums softly, tunelessly. Your little sister has finally passed out beside the turnip bin, clutching a stuffed scrap of cloth you once used to wipe down the table. And you're mending. Not your shoes this time, though they could use it, but your tunic. Or rather, your cousin's old tunic, which has been let out and stitched back together so many times. It's become a map of survival. The seam under your arm tore at market when you lifted the grain sack. Now you thread a needle, slowly, carefully pricking your finger at least twice before you get the tension right. Clothes in the Middle Ages weren't just outfits, they were investments. A full set could cost a month's wages, so people wore what they had, until it fell apart, then stitched it up and wore it some more. There was no such thing as fast fashion unless you count changing out of your work tunic into your slightly less stained feast tunic. And yes, there was such a thing as a feast tunic. The wealthy, of course, dressed differently. Their garments were dyed, trimmed, embroidered, layered. Silk if they were fancy, imported linen if they were really fancy. You once saw a noblewoman riding past in a gown so long it needed a servant just to hold the train off the mud. She smelled like honey and cloves. You smelled like onions and regret. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what right down to the fabric's colours and embellishments. If you were a peasant and dared to wear velvet or deep purple, you could be fined, or worse. Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced or just social guidelines with occasional bite. You glance at your tunic again. It's dyed a dull brown naturally because that's what you could make from walnut husks. Most of your wardrobe matches mud tones, soot tones, and a sort of patchy moss if you're lucky. Colour wasn't banned for you, it was just expensive. Achieving indigo took imported woad or complicated fermentation. Bright reds required cochineal or madder root, and unless you had a dye house nearby, forget it. Even the act of dyeing fabric was a trial. It required vats of steaming liquid, days of soaking, and a nose of steel. Some dye ingredients, like fermented urine, weren't exactly perfume. You remember once helping a neighbour boil onion skins to make golden yellow thread. Your hands smelled for days. As you finish the seam, you tug gently to test the strength. It holds, for now. You hang the tunic over the fire to dry, watching as steam rises from the damp fabric. The warmth is comforting, but you're careful it wouldn't be the first time a drying shirt caught a spark. That was a fun week. Your brother wore a sackcloth for 5 days and pretended it was a knight's tabard. You still tease him about it. There's a soft knock at the door. You freeze. It's late, too late for visitors. But then a voice calls low and raspy. Old Marjorie. She's brought something. You let her in, stepping aside as she limps into the room. Her cloak is damp and she smells like wet wool and thyme. She hands you a small, wrapped bundle dried yarrow comfrey and a little beeswax salve. For the swelling, she mutters, gesturing at your ankles. You blink, surprised by the gesture. Thanks, you say softly. She nods once, then turns to go. No lingering, no small talk. Just another night in a world where kindness wears rough boots and carries secrets. As she leaves, you unwrap the bundle, inhaling the bitter grassy scent. You rub some of the salve into your aching joints, sighing as the stiffness eases just a little. Medieval medicine wasn't scientific by today's standards, but people did what they could. Herbs, poultices, prayers. Hope, mostly. There were remedies for everything, though not all of them worked. A sore throat gargle with vinegar and honey. Fever tie a toad skin to your arm. Pregnancy pains. Press a stone from the River Wye to your stomach. Some worked by accident, some by placebo, some by mystery. Historians still debate how much medieval medicine helped versus how much it simply distracted. You lean back against the wall, feet stretched out toward the hearth. Your body is tired, bone-deep tired, but your mind drifts to other things, like what it would feel like to own more than 2 tunics, to have a cloak that actually repels rain, to wear a gown that swishes when you walk instead of clings when you sweat. But those are luxuries. You live in a world where every stitch matters, where hand-me-downs carry stories and patches are badges of persistence, where fabric is labour and labour is life. Still you dream of soft wool, of real sleeves, of colours that don't come from mud. And even though you know tomorrow will bring smoke and straw blisters and chores, you let yourself imagine for just a moment that somewhere someone's sewing a future that fits you perfectly. You wake to the sound of chickens again. It's not their clucking that startles you exactly. It's the way the sun slants through the cracks in the wooden walls, just enough to hit your eyes, just enough to tell you you've overslept by, maybe 6 minutes. In this life, that's practically a scandal. So you sit up, stretch slowly and touch your belly. The child inside you is still, but the weight is there, persistent pulsing, a centre of gravity you didn't ask for, but now carry with a kind of strange reverence. You swing your legs over the edge of the straw mattress and wince. The floor is cold, your ankles are swollen. Your tunic smells like smoke and last night's soup. You put it on anyway. Today is laundry day. Well, to be more accurate, it's your version of laundry day. which means dragging the wooden tub near the hearth, pouring in water you fetched from the creek before breakfast, and hoping the fire stays hot enough to warm it. Washing clothes is not a gentle event in your world. It's an upper body workout with a side of blisters. As you stir the steaming water, you glance at the soap, a hard lump of ash and animal fat. Homemade naturally. You remember rendering the tallow weeks ago, your eyes stinging as the smell clung to your hair for days. Historians agree medieval soap was effective but hardly luxurious. Some even debate whether it made you cleaner or just differently grimy. You add it to the tub, then begin scrubbing a shift against the washboard, though washboard is a bit generous. It's just a flat board with shallow grooves your brother carved with a dull knife. Still it works. You wash one piece of clothing at a time, knuckles reddening. You pause now and then to catch your breath. And while your arms ache, you can't help but think this is the cleanest these garments will be all month. A quirky tidbit. In some towns there were designated communal washhouses near rivers. Women gathered not just to clean but to talk gossip and share remedies. Some even brought bread dough to let rise near the warm stones while they worked. A medieval multitasking dream. Not here though. Here you wash alone. It gives you time to think. About your life, your child, your mother's life. The loop of survival, thick as wool and just as tangled. You hang the damp clothes over a rope strung between two beams. They drip steadily onto the dirt floor, which now smells like damp wool and ash. Again. Always. Outside, a breeze stirs. You push open the door and squint. The sky is pale, cloudy, undecided. It might rain, or not. You grab the last tunic from the basket and head outside anyway. The wind is sharp. It cuts through your sleeves and sends a shiver through your spine, but you welcome it. Cold is honest. Cold doesn't pretend to be anything but itself. You pin the tunic to a splintered wooden frame propped near the firewood pile. Then you turn and stop. There's a boy near the fence. Maybe 12, maybe younger, it's hard to tell under all that mud. He's holding a basket of mushrooms and a wild rabbit. He sees you and grins. He's your cousin's son. Or maybe your neighbour's nephew. You're too tired to keep track. But he nods respectfully and gestures toward the mushrooms. For your ma, he says. You thank him. He scratches his nose and adds, Reckon you'll need 'em soon with the little one coming. It's not a question. It's a fact. Everyone knows. Everyone always knows. And yet there's something kind in his tone. No judgment. Just mushrooms and a grin and a quiet understanding. You take the basket inside. Later you slice the mushrooms, add them to the stew and thank the boy silently. Kindness in this world isn't rare, it's just quiet. It shows up in small ways. In herbs left at the door. In fish shared from a good haul. In someone offering to watch the chickens so you can sit for 10 minutes without explaining why. As the sun sinks, you move the dry clothes back inside. You fold them slowly, stacking tunics by the hearth to catch the last of the warmth. Then you settle down on your stool and begin darning socks. Again. Some days you wonder how anyone had time for embroidery. And yet embroidery was everywhere, in noble halls, in church banners, in the hems of festival gowns. It told stories, marked status, even protected the wearer, if you believed in stitch magic. Historians still debate how much of medieval embroidery was art versus superstition. Maybe it was both. You stitch a clumsy X into your brother's sock and think I'd make a terrible noblewoman, but a decent survivor. The fire pops. A coal rolls out. You nudge it back in with a stick. Night falls. The clothes are clean, your fingers are sore, your belly aches, but the child kicks gently as if to say, still here. And so are you. Still washing. Still working. Still weaving a life threadbare but strong. You wake up to the sound of a thud. Not loud, not urgent. Just that dull, unmistakable sound of something falling in a wooden house, wood on wood. You blink in the dark, your hand already on your belly feeling for movement. The child within you gives a slow stretch, more like a ripple than a kick. Everything seems normal as it gets. You grope around for the small oil lamp on the floor beside your straw mattress. You strike the flint with cold fingers once, twice, then finally catch a flicker. The lamp casts a soft amber glow, flickering across the beams above and revealing the source of the noise your little sister has fallen out of bed again. You sigh, rise, and gently nudge her back onto her mat, covering her with a rough blanket she always kicks off in her sleep. She doesn't even stir, just mumbles something about plums and rolls over. You sit for a moment, stretching your back, your knees, everything. Pregnancy historians agree was an all-consuming state in the Middle Ages, Not just physically, but socially, spiritually, even cosmically. You were expected to carry it all quietly. You get up and add a bit of peat to the fire. The room smells of smoke and damp earth and onion again. You glance at the bundle of wool on the bench near the fire. It's waiting. So are the chickens. And the rabbit in the snare trap if the gods were kind overnight. But this morning, you do something rare. You step outside first. The pre-dawn air is damp and blue-grey. Mist clings to the edges of the field beyond your fence. Everything is soft, wet, unspoken. You pull your shawl tighter and walk slowly toward the garden plot behind the house. The earth is soaked from last night's drizzle, but not too much. You crouch down, not gracefully, but with purpose, and check on the root vegetables. A few early turnips, some sprigs of parsley, a beetroot the size of your fist. You pluck it gently and wipe the dirt off on your tunic. You glance up and freeze. A deer stands at the edge of the trees, small, skittish, watching you. Its ears twitch once and then it darts into the brush like a ghost. You don't know why, but you smile. Maybe because you saw something wild, something untouched, something unburdened. You bring the beet inside and set it near the fire. Your father is up now, already carving a wooden comb with the small knife he inherited from his grandfather. Your mother is kneading dough with arms that never rest. There's a plum stain on her apron and a thread of grey in her braid that you swear wasn't there last week. Your sister sneezes in her sleep. You pick up your wool and start carding. Back and forth, back and forth. It's a rhythm your hands know better than your thoughts. In time with the fire's crackle. In time with the world. Did you know some medieval women believed that wool held blessings? That what you wove near the hearth would keep your family warm in more than one way? Scholars debate whether this was spiritual or just wishful thinking, but you believe a little in both. Your mother pauses her kneading and looks over. "We'll dye it with onion skins," she says. A warm yellow. You nod. Not because you care about the colour, but because it's a plan, and plans mean there's still time to carry them out. Later, while your sister feeds the hens, and your father sets out to check the fence posts, you sit with a small bundle of the carded wool, and you do something else rare. You sing. Softly. Not even a song, really. Just a tune your mother hummed when she was your age. You don't remember the words. Maybe there were no words. Maybe that's the point. Your baby kicks and you place your hand gently on your belly. You're not sure if the motion was approval or complaint. Inside, your mother drops the dough into the pot for boiling and mutters something about salt. Outside, a rooster starts to crow again, far too late as always. You chuckle and tell him we're already up. There's a peace in the ordinary today, a warmth in the repetition. You sit back, rest for a second. Your mother sees and says nothing, just lets you be. That's how you know it's a good day. You reach for a bit of dry wool and begin spinning a thread by hand, watching it tighten and twist between your fingers. Not perfect, but strong enough. And as you do, you think not about childbirth or fear or how your tunic barely fits anymore, but about the beetroot on the hearth, the yellow wool to come the deer in the mist, and how rare it is to feel, if only for a breath, like things might be okay. You don't plan to visit Marjorie today, but fate, or maybe just a slippery patch of mud near the chicken coop, has other plans. It's nothing serious, just a sudden twist your foot skidding out beneath you as you go to scatter a handful of barley. One moment, you're upright, balanced, pretending everything's fine, and the next you're clutching your lower back with a hiss and squinting up at a chicken who looks entirely unfazed by your collapse. Pregnancy makes you feel like a sack of potatoes sometimes, an overstuffed one with legs. You laugh bitterly at yourself, brush the dirt from your elbows and mutter something about the coop needing gravel. Then you limp inside. Your mother raises an eyebrow but doesn't ask. She's gutting the last of the summer trout. It smells faintly of river moss and salt. "Go see Marjorie," she says without looking up. Just in case. You want to protest. You always want to protest, but you know better. So, you bundle yourself in a shawl, grab a pouch of dried marjoram as payment, and set out for the edge of the woods. Marjorie's hut always smells like secrets. Not just herbs, though. The air is thick with thyme sage and something sweetly medicinal you can never quite name, but old earth-boiled nettles and something deeper like a memory that didn't wash out properly. She greets you with a look, not a smile. Just that look. That Marjorie look. The one that scans your face, your belly, your gait, and tells her everything she needs to know. She takes the marjoram, sniffs it, grunts, and waves you in. You sit on the edge of her wooden stool and she presses fingers to your lower back, muttering about posture and centre of gravity. She gives you a wrapped ball of something that smells like vinegar and honey, and tells you to press it to your skin at sunset. She doesn't explain why. She never does. Historians still debate whether women like Marjorie were healers, witches, or just the only people paying attention. The church tolerated them sometimes if they kept quiet and didn't stir trouble. But midwives walked a thin line between life and death, between science and superstition. Marjorie doesn't bother with lines, she just walks where she pleases. She offers you a small cup of something warm, probably nettle tea with a few stolen rose hips, and you sip without asking questions. It's bitter, but comforting, like her. She tells you a story while you drink, about a woman who gave birth during a thunderstorm and claimed the baby came out humming. Marjorie shrugs. Probably the wind in the chimney, but still. You chuckle and sip again. And for a moment, you're not scared, because someone here believes they've seen worse and lived through it. Someone here knows the names of bones and plants and fears and doesn't flinch at any of them. Someone here knows what to do when the coop floor betrays you. You thank her eyes slowly and make your way back through the trees. The light has changed while you were inside, thinner now, angled and golden. It paints the grass with long shadows and makes the smoke from your chimney look like a blessing. At home, your sister is peeling wild onions and humming off-key. Your father is carving another spoon, though the last 3 are already stacked in the corner. Your mother sets down a bowl and says she give you that awful vinegar thing. You nod. She says it works, you reply, settling down by the hearth again. She always says that. You sit gingerly and hold the vinegar-wrapped cloth to your skin. It stings a little, then warms, then fades into something almost pleasant. You don't ask for sympathy, you don't expect it, but your mother drops an extra piece of bread into your bowl and says, "Eat slow, it's still hot." And that somehow is enough. Later, while the rest of the family drifts into evening chores, you remain near the fire watching the embers fall into themselves. You turn the vinegar cloth over once then again. The warmth seeps into you not just through the skin, but deeper. You think of Marjorie's humming baby, of the storm, of the way stories become talismans when you have nothing else. And you wonder if someday someone will tell a story about you. Maybe not in a grand hall, maybe not with your name, but perhaps, just perhaps, someone will say, "She walked to Marjorie's hut with a crooked back and came home with her strength." Maybe that's all we get. Not glory, but grit. You lean back, careful not to crush the bundle against your spine, and exhale. The chickens have gone quiet, the wind has settled, and for once you don't feel quite so breakable. You wake before the sun. The fire's died down to a sighing whisper of ash, and the cold has crept in like a rumour, quiet, invisible, and all-consuming. You lie still for a few seconds, one hand instinctively on your belly, the other curled under your cheek. The baby stirs, not quite kicking, just shifting, a reminder that it's there, that you're still 2 people inside one. The roof creaks. A mouse skitters behind the grain jar. You close your eyes just for 1 heartbeat longer and pretend you don't have to get up. But pretending never churned butter or fed hens. So you rise. The floor is stone cold. The draft, as usual, is committed to making your life interesting. You wrap your shawl tighter and shuffle toward the hearth to coax the fire back from the brink. There's a ritual to it now, poke blow, add straw, whisper. Something halfway between a curse and a prayer. Eventually the embers answer. You make porridge from what's left of the oats. Thin and grey, but warm. The scent is almost enough to wake your sister, who appears wrapped in a blanket like a wormy little ghost. She's always hungry, always cold. You give her the bigger bowl, and as you sip your own, you look out the sliver of window that passes for a view and watch the light slowly change. Morning in the village arrives, not like a trumpet, but a limp cough. Smoke from chimneys, distant goat bleats the clink of buckets at the well. You could write the script by now. Historians often describe medieval mornings as structured by necessity. You don't wake with the sun because it's romantic, you wake because if you don't, the animals yell, the porridge burns, and the water freezes in the bucket. It's less charming than it sounds. After breakfast, your mother hands you the wool. There's always wool. Mountains of it. Endless beige, scratchy, stubborn wool. You card it with wooden paddles until your wrists ache and your fingers cramp. Somewhere in the fibres, you're pretty sure your dreams are hiding, tangled and forgotten. The fringe fact. Some women use thistles instead of proper wool carders. Yes, thistles. As in painful, pokey garden nightmares. You give thanks for your paddles. Your little sister is singing again badly and pretending the spoon she's holding is a knight's sword. You let her. Everyone deserves a fantasy. Yours used to involve a feather mattress and a bath that didn't make your skin itch. She asks you why people wear wool when it's so itchy. You blink and realise you don't actually know. Because it's warm. Because it's what you have. Because goats are cheaper than silk. Because nothing else survives, the wet, the mud, the smoke. It's a good question. You tell her because it keeps you alive. She nods as if you've just handed her a sword forged in legend. Your mother hums in approval from across the room. You keep carding. Later you help with the dyeing. Not for anything fancy. Just dull brown from walnut husks and a muddy green that comes from soaking nettles in a copper pot. It smells like bad soup. You try not to breathe too deeply. Clothing colours in the Middle Ages weren't just aesthetic, they were social signposts. Deep blue, you're rich. Bright red, even richer. And if your garment sparkles, you're probably royalty or dangerously pretending to be. Your tunic is the colour of baked dirt. It's been patched so many times you've started naming the sections. This one's the left elbow of despair, that patched knee of eternal shame. The hem. Let's not talk about the hem. Historians still argue whether peasants truly embraced the roughness of their garb or whether they simply had no other choice. Spoiler alert, probably the second one. And yet even in all its roughness, there's something about your tunic that's yours. Maybe it's the fact that you've bled into it, cried into it, carried sacks and babies and worries in it. Maybe it's because you've outgrown it and it still tries to cling. Maybe it's just cloth and you're overthinking things because you haven't had anything sweet in weeks. By midday, you're sweating. The fire's back to roaring and the dye pot is belching steam like an irritated dragon. You open the door to cool off and the outside world hits you with a gust of manure pine and chimney smoke. It's a cocktail, one you'd never bottle, but somehow it still smells like home. Old Marjorie is hobbling past on her way to collect herbs. She gives you another one of those looks. You nod. She nods. The truce holds. Your father is in the yard fixing a broken pail with a length of twine and a questionable expression. He waves the twine like a magician about to perform. It'll hold, he says. It never does. But you smile, because this absurd patchwork fragile life is still life. You lean against the doorframe for just a moment, letting the cool air touch your face. Your belly feels heavier today. The baby hasn't kicked since dawn. You place your hand there. Wait. Then, there it is. A small nudge, like a reminder that yes, something's still growing, still hoping, and you breathe a little deeper. You turn back inside. There's more wool. More dyeing, more scraping ash from the hearth and explaining for the 100th time that no, your sister cannot marry the goat. It's exhausting. It's endless. It's everything. And somehow, it's enough. The day drifts forward in quiet chores and tiny interruptions. A neighbour stops by to borrow a pinch of salt, though really, she's here to gossip. She sits by the fire rearranging her shawl and asks if you've heard about the miller's daughter, the one who stitched her hemline so tight she couldn't kneel properly in church. Scandalous and impractical. You nod politely, offer her a ladle of thin stew and listen, while threading a needle through another tear in your tunic. Medieval garments, you've noticed, are held together by stubbornness, hope and stitches that look like they were sewn by candlelight in a thunderstorm, which honestly is sometimes accurate. The neighbour departs with the salt and you return to your work. Mending, folding, organising woolens by function, rough outer tunics for farm work finer, though still coarse linen underlayers for sleep or feast days if those ever come around again. You run your hand along a sleeve and wonder how many winters it survived. Historians often note that medieval people owned very few clothes, maybe 2 or 3 sets total. Washing was laborious. Soap was harsh. Lye burned your hands and your patience. Which is why you spot the irony when someone suggests wearing your best to a festival. Your best might be the one tunic that doesn't smell like cabbage. You look out the window again. It's afternoon now, and the light has taken on that soft sideways gold that hints at evening's slow approach. Outside, chickens peck at dirt with furious concentration, and your sister is attempting to coax a cat into wearing a flower crown. It's not going well. You smile until your mother calls from the yard. She needs help stretching a hide. You sigh and put down your stitching. The hide smells awful. It's stiff, wet, and stubborn like half the men in the village. You brace one end while your mother pulls at the other, and together you work in rhythm using bone tools to scrape away the flesh. It's dirty, smelly work, but it's necessary. Leather, after all, is part of everything. Shoes, belts, knife, sheaths, and those odd little girdles some women wear beneath their dresses. You've seen rich folk with gloves too thin as parchment and embroidered with thread spun from heaven knows what. Silk unicorn hair. You joke about it with your mother. She doesn't laugh. She just nods toward the pot. You'll need to tan this one by next week. You nod. Your hands ache. The fringe fact. Some medieval tanners used fermented dog dung to process hides. Yep, dog dung. You try not to think about it, but now you'll never unknow that smell. Back inside the fire's down again. You poke it back to life. The pot of turnips on the hearth has begun to split, revealing their pale insides. You season them with salt, just enough to remind your tongue it still remembers flavour. Your father brings in a bundle of herbs, mugwort marjoram, and something bitter that he claims will keep the fleas away. He's wrong, but it does make the room smell like someone's been boiling an old boot. Your mother mutters about soup. You nod. Dinner comes and goes without ceremony. Everyone eats in near silence, chewing, swallowing, exhaling. It's not that you don't speak. It's just that by this hour your voices are hoarse from the day. You're all too tired for anything but shared warmth. Your little sister finishes her portion and then leans against you, her head heavy on your arm. You tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear and press a kiss to her forehead. She doesn't notice already halfway to dreaming. You glance across the room. The fire flickers. Your father has fallen asleep upright, still holding a spoon. Your mother is sewing by candlelight, her shadow dancing on the wall like a second self. And you, still dressed in that rough wool, still with hands dyed faint green from nettles, wonder just briefly what it would feel like to walk into a room where you didn't smell like smoke and fatigue. What would it be like to wear something made only for beauty? Not warmth, not function, not utility. Just beauty. Historians still argue whether medieval people saw clothing as self-expression or sheer survival. Maybe it was both. You suspect it depended on how many mouths were waiting to be fed. Eventually your mother extinguishes the candle and the room darkens to a hush. You carry your sister to the sleeping mat, lay her down gently and crawl in beside her. The straw pokes your back, the wool itches your neck, but your body is too tired to care. You lie still, eyes open, watching the fire fade to red. Somewhere out there under a brighter sky, women walk in gowns made of air and stars. But here tonight, in your humble, drafty, smoky corner of the world, you wear your history like a second skin. And it holds. The fire has burned down to embers now, casting soft, flickering shadows against the cracked walls of your one-room home. You lie there in the near dark, the weight of your day pressing evenly against your limbs like another blanket, heavier than wool but familiar. Your sister shifts beside you, murmuring something in her sleep, and you instinctively reach to pull the edge of the blanket back over her shoulder. Outside, the wind picks up. You hear it pushing against the door like an old friend come to visit, moaning softly through the cracks, curling under the threshold, and bringing with it the scent of wet earth and smoke from distant fires. It reminds you that everything leaks in. In the morning, you'll rise again, your clothing still damp from yesterday's rain, your boots still carrying the weight of last week's mud. But tonight you drift through the remnants of your thoughts, and those thoughts are stitched with thread. Because in your world, clothing isn't just something you put on. It's something you're born into. It marks your station, your labour, your worth, or the lack thereof. And it tells the story of your body whether you want it to or not. You remember the time the Lord's wife passed through the village. You were maybe 8. She wore a dress so long that it dragged across the ground like mist, its sleeves draped from her arms like the wings of a ghost. She wore jewels, not many, but just enough to catch the light and throw it back in little stabs of envy. You'd never seen anything like it. That memory lives in your brain like a stain. The way she moved light and clean as if the world had never touched her. And you, standing barefoot in a tunic patched with your brother's old shirt, suddenly realized how loudly your clothes could speak. Mainstream history often points out that fashion was deeply tied to class. Sumptuary laws were even passed to limit what peasants could wear. Certain colours, fabrics or embellishments were reserved only for the nobility. Red, for example, wasn't just red. It was power. It was wealth. It was the ability to buy cochineal or madder dye, and the servants needed to scrub it into fabric. You, by contrast, wore colours that came from weeds. Nettle green, muck brown, cloudy beige if you were lucky, and shoes, sometimes, if it wasn't too muddy, or too dry, or too far. But here's a fringe fact to chew on while your mind relaxes. Some medieval peasants stuffed their shoes with moss for comfort. Nature's insoles. You tried it once. It made your feet itchy for a week. You roll onto your side, adjusting your bundle of straw. The light from the hearth pulses softly across the room where your mother's old cloak hangs beside the door. It's stiff with years of use shaped now, like her posture curved at the shoulder, folded at the hem. She's never thrown it away. Clothes in this life are too valuable for sentimentality. They're patched. They're shared. They're inherited like secrets. Historians still argue whether peasants had much say in their own fashion. Most records come from the wealthy illuminated manuscripts, inventories, portraits. But you know what choice looks like in your world? It's choosing between two threadbare tunics that don't itch too badly. Still, people find a way. A scrap of embroidery here. A coloured ribbon stolen from the market there. A pair of sleeves taken from a dress long gone and stitched onto a new bodice, not for style, but because the arms were warmer than the chest. You remember once seeing a girl at church with flowers stitched along her neckline. Dandelions and violets. You were maybe 13. It looked like she was blooming out of her dress. She got scolded for it later too, Vane, said the priest. Too much vanity in poor girls. And yet you still think of those flowers sometimes when you're mending your own sleeves. There's something gently defiant about beauty made from nothing. About taking a life built from mud and fire and smoke and making it sing in thread. Another gust of wind rattles the shutter. The fire sighs settling lower in the pit. And your thoughts drift again to hands, so many hands, stitching, spinning, dyeing, boiling, scraping. All across the country, women just like you and nothing like you are threading their days together with bone needles and patience. Some of them hum while they work. Some curse. Some pray. Some dream of silks and velvets, but most just want a tunic without holes. And tomorrow, if you have the energy, you'll sew another patch onto your cousin's old cloak. You'll dye a new batch of wool in marigold petals and onion skins, hoping for something cheerful. You'll scrape mud from your boots and pretend they're leather. And maybe, just maybe, you'll stitch a tiny flower into your hem. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to remind you that you're still alive, still here, still clothed in this messy, threadbare, beautiful life. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, but because the wind has changed direction, and now it's whispering straight into your ears. Your blanket has slipped down during the night, and the chill bites at your knees. You pull it up, but you're already too awake to fall back asleep. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows a late one, honestly, and your body starts moving before your mind is ready. Your feet find the floor cold and uneven. Straw crackles under your toes. The air smells of soot cabbage and something faintly sour. Welcome to another day in fashion's least glamorous century. You shuffle toward the hearth. The embers are sulking under a grey layer of ash, but with some coaxing, blowing, stirring, maybe a little begging, you get a flame to catch. And now it's time to get dressed. You pick up your shift first, the long underdress you've been wearing for 3 winters now. It was once white. Now it's somewhere between oatmeal and regret. Over that goes your kirtle and ankle-length garment cinched with a thin rope. It hugs your waist and flares just enough at the bottom to allow you to walk without tripping every 5 steps. You have only one pair of hose and they sag no matter how tightly you tie them. But hey, they're not full of holes this week. Small wins. Mainstream historians describe medieval peasant attire as practical, but that's like calling a stone moderately chewable. Sure, it covers you. It keeps out some wind. But practical doesn't mean comfortable, and it definitely doesn't mean flattering. You've never once put something on and thought, wow, this really brings out the colour of my eyes. Nope. It's more like, this doesn't smell too bad and the sleeves still move. And then out the door you go. Your neighbours are already up. You see smoke rising from chimneys, see one man loading firewood onto a cart, and another woman wringing out linens beside a stream. You nod. They nod back. There's no time for long greetings when you all wear the same week-old clothes and the same chores await. You think about your cousin in the next village. She once told you about her lord's wife, how she wore a corset so tight she couldn't sit properly and had to eat standing up. Can you imagine she laughed? And you both laughed too, because the idea of clothes that were uncomfortable on purpose seemed like rich people had finally cracked under their own wealth. Still, you wonder what it must feel like to have clothes tailored to your body. To walk without tugging something into place every other step. To have a neckline chosen because it suited your face, not because it was the only clean tunic left. Then again, you also heard about a noblewoman who had her shoes made so long and pointy that she had to tie the tips up to her knees to walk. Historians still argue whether that trend was born from fashion or from a desperate need to prove you didn't actually have to walk. Probably both. And then there were the crazy hats. Those enormous Hennin's cone-shaped towers of fabric that made noblewomen look like inverted ice cream cones. You've never seen one in real life, of course. Only heard whispers, seen a crude drawing once in the margins of a prayer book. You imagine wearing one and immediately getting it stuck in the doorframe. Back in your reality, your head covering is a square of linen tied simply behind your neck. It keeps your hair from falling into the soup pot, and more importantly, from catching lice from your sister. Your mother always says modest hair makes for quiet mouths. You're not sure exactly what that means, but you nod every time. And it does keep your head warmer. That's good enough. You carry a bucket to the well. The morning fog hasn't lifted yet, so everything is grey and muffled like the world is still half asleep. The bucket's handle bites into your palm, but your cloak dulls some of the weight on your shoulders. This cloak is your armour. It's made from rough spun wool dyed with walnut husks and thyme. It smells like the attic of a forest, and you secretly love it. It has one clasp carved from bone, and it creaks every time you bend, which is often. You pass a group of children playing with sticks and stones, their tunics flapping around their knees. One of them wears a tunic so patched it looks like a quilt walking upright. You smile. You were that quilt once. Still are on laundry day. You head back to the cottage, your arms full of water, your head full of thoughts. About how even the poorest of the poor try to express something through clothes. A stitch here, a dye there, a little flare on a sleeve. Not because anyone will see it, but because you will. And sometimes that's enough. There's an old woman in the village bent like a question mark who embroiders little suns on all her cuffs. No one knows why. Maybe she just likes the colour yellow. Maybe she's praying for warmth. Or maybe it's her quiet way of fighting the cold. You sit by the fire again, sipping something vaguely vegetable-flavoured, and watch your sister lace up her boots. They're too big. They always have been. She stuffs them with straw and rags and hope. Just like you used to. Just like you still do. Because medieval fashion wasn't made for comfort. It wasn't made for style. It wasn't made for you at all. But you still managed to make it yours. One patch, one dye pot, one stubborn thread at a time. You're standing at the edge of the woods now, arms wrapped tightly in your wool cloak, listening to the way the morning wind rustles the branches, soft and brittle, like dry bread being crumbled in slow motion. You've come to collect kindling because in your world heat doesn't come with a switch, and your sleeves stitched and restitched again catch on the twigs as you move. You sigh. It's always something with these clothes, but it's not like you have many options. There's your work tunic, your market tunic, and your funeral tunic, which your mother swears she'll haunt you over if you ever wear it for chores. The line between costume and survival, between fashion and function, blurs here. Historians often divide medieval clothes into sumptuary and practical, but for you the difference is much simpler. This still fits and this doesn't. You kneel, gathering twigs into your basket, and catch sight of a splash of green embroidery along your hem. It's almost invisible now, worn down by rain and years, but it was once a vine stitched there by your aunt before her hands stiffened with age. She said it was for luck. You don't know if it ever brought you any, but you like the way it curls even now in its faded dignity. Back at the cottage, you dump the kindling near the fire and help your mother with the laundry. Today, it's boiling linens in a pot so big you could bathe a goat in it. You won't, but still nice to know. Steam rises. Your shift clings to your back. You fan yourself with your apron and wish just once that your clothes breathe like they're supposed to. But the flax fibres are heavy with water and everything smells like ash. Sometimes you dream of silk, of those shimmering fabrics you've only heard about from travellers, the kind that catch the light like water and whisper when you walk. Historians still argue whether silk was ever truly accessible outside the nobility, but in your head, it's real. You can feel it. Cool light, a kind of second skin. Instead, you get coarse wool and bleached linen, and maybe on a really lucky day, a scrap of worn velvet sewn onto the edge of a sleeve. Your neighbours trade little luxuries like others trade gossip. A strip of fur, a brass button, a bit of lace so delicate you're afraid to breathe near it. That's your fashion scene. Forget runways. This is survival couture. Once your cousin made a headband out of braided leather and thread. She wore it to festival day and it started a small trend. For about 2 weeks, every girl under 20 had one. Then one caught fire during a midsummer bonfire, and that was that. Fads don't last long when your accessories are flammable. You laugh a little at the memory. In a world like this, even the smallest fashion experiments come with a side of risk. But maybe that's what makes them worth it. You walk into the village square later, headed toward the bakehouse. The baker's apprentice is pulling loaves from the oven with sleeves rolled up flour dusting her arms like snow. Her apron's torn but clean. Her hair's wrapped in a scarf that's patterned with faded sunbursts. Not regulation, not church approved, just hers. And somehow it fits her like royalty. That's the thing about medieval clothes. They may all look the same from a distance, but once you get close, you see the rebellion in every stitch. A sleeve cut slightly shorter for ease. A hem lifted an inch to avoid the muck. A pocket sewn where no pocket should be. Because when every inch of fabric costs days of labour, you don't waste it on fashion for fashion's sake. You turn it into a story. Your story? Your mother's apron still bears the blue smudge of woad dye from a summer she spent working with a tanner. Your brother's tunic is patched with 3 different fabrics, none matching, because the only thing more powerful than pride is a mother with a needle. and your own cloak. The clasp came from your grandmother's wedding dress. She gave it to you when you turned 12 and said, try not to lose it, but if you do make sure it's during something interesting. You've nearly lost it 3 times, including once to a goat. So far, nothing interesting enough. Still, you keep hoping. Fashion here isn't fast. It's glacial, generational, passed down, worn down, and stubbornly stitched back together with memories. You think of that old saying, clothes make the man. Here clothes make the woman, and then she makes them back over and over until they hold not just warmth, but time. You slip into the bakery for a moment of warmth, cheeks flushed from the wind. A neighbour nods to you, tugging her hood lower. It's fur-lined, and just for a second you envy the softness. Then you remember how it smells in the rain, and the envy disappears. Outside, the wind picks up again. You pull your cloak tighter, tuck a strand of hair behind your ear, and walk home beneath the weight of wool and weather and the quiet dignity of clothes made to last. Because strange or not scratchy or not medieval fashion tells the story of people who never had the luxury of throwing things away. And that, in its own threadbare way, is a kind of beauty too. You wake to the sound of geese arguing outside and the stiff crackle of your shift drying by the hearth. The wind has shifted again, and every corner of the cottage feels colder than the last. You groan, roll onto your side, and immediately regret it. Your back aches, your hips ache, even your earlobes seem to ache. That's what sleeping on a straw mattress in a medieval winter does to you. Your body wakes up confused about which century it's in. Still, you get up like always. You reach for your clothes, stiff with cold, and fumble into them with all the enthusiasm of a goose walking backward. The tunic is a familiar weight. It's wool rough but dependable. The same belt you've worn for 5 years wraps around your waist, though it now rests a little higher thanks to your growing belly. You think about belts, actually. Not the holds your pants up variety, but the ones stitched with bronze and dyed leather wrapped ceremonially around nobles, like little waist-bound declarations of power. In certain periods, belts told stories. Who you served, who you loved, who you'd lost. Some were even adorned with tiny verses of poetry written in gold thread and meant to be read only by those who dared get close enough. Historians still argue whether such belts were ever worn in battle or just at court, but either way you doubt your leather cord could carry more than a turnip knife. Out in the yard, your sister is hauling a bucket of water, slipping slightly on the icy path, but managing not to spill a drop. She's wearing a hand-me-down cloak that used to belong to your uncle, which explains why it reaches her ankles and smells faintly of smoked fish. She waves at you with mittened fingers and grins like she's just found a coin. You grin back. There's something almost sweet about it, how in a world where you have so little hand-me-downs don't feel shameful. They feel earned. Clothes don't just warm you, they remember you. Every stain, every stitch, every mended rip is a chronicle of life lived fully, awkwardly, clumsily. Your cousin once fell into a mud pit while chasing a loose piglet and permanently ruined the front of her best tunic. Now it's her gardening outfit. When you see her, you don't think she fell into mud. You think she's still wearing that thing. And somehow that's comforting. Inside the cottage, your mother is sorting through a basket of odd scraps, frayed ribbons, worn-out laces, a few copper hooks she insists came from your grandfather's doublet. She's muttering about mending your father's hose again, swearing that if he tears the crotch one more time, she's sewing it shut. You smirk. He'll just ask you to undo it later with your nimble fingers. That's the quiet duty of women here, patching the dignity back into the garments of men who'd never admit they needed mending. But dignity is elastic in this world. You once saw a nobleman pass through the village in boots so tall and pointed, they looked like exaggerated mouse noses. People whispered he must be very rich or very insecure. Maybe both. The shoes were called poulaines, and they were banned multiple times across Europe for being too impractical, too silly, or just too French. Historians still debate whether they were worn in battle, probably not, but you remember thinking it must be hard to run in those. Here running matters more than peacocking. When the weather turns and the pigs bolt or the thatch leaks, you're not thinking about ankle laces. You're thinking about wool thickness and whether you can outrun the rain. You stir the stew pot and glance at your reflection in the iron ladle. Your cheeks are red, your eyes tired, but the scarf around your neck is the one you embroidered yourself last spring. Tiny red flowers crooked as they are creep along the edge like they're trying to tell you something. No one taught you embroidery exactly. You watched your grandmother do it once, then picked up the needle and started experimenting. That's how learning works here, by watching, doing, and bleeding a little. You once bled into your cousin's wedding veil, in fact, and no one noticed. You told yourself it was symbolic. You think about that veil now folded somewhere in a cedar chest, probably nibbled by moths. She moved to a town near the river after marrying a boatman. You hear she owns 2 shifts now. 2, and her own comb. Luxury. Outside the bell in the village square rings noon, and you know it's time to help with the wool cart. As you step out, your apron flaps in the breeze like a flag of minor resistance. The wool smells like damp sheep and hard labour. You load the cart anyway, arms, aching fingers stiff, but your mind drifts to dreams of colours you've never worn. Teal, rose madder, saffron yellow. The monks at the nearby priory once painted manuscripts with those pigments. You saw one page once smuggled to your village by a merchant who liked to trade oddities for cider. It had a saint with a robe that looked like the inside of a peach outlined in gold as fine as spider silk. You didn't breathe the whole time you looked at it, and then the merchant took it back and it vanished into the pockets of history. But you remember that colour. You dream of wearing it someday, absurd as it sounds. Because even in a world of mud and wool and mended seams, you're allowed to dream. And maybe, just maybe, dreams are stitched into the very weave of every medieval thread. You finish stacking the wool, brush your hands off on your apron, and sit on the edge of the cart to catch your breath. The cold is biting, but it wakes you up better than a slap. And for a moment, you just sit there watching the sky. It's a patchy blue today, the kind of winter sky that doesn't promise snow, but doesn't rule it out either. Overhead, a pair of crows argue loudly on a crooked tree branch like 2 drunk uncles at a feast. Typical. Your tunic pulls a little tighter across your belly as you shift. The baby kicks. Or hiccups. Hard to tell at this point. You hum under your breath and rest a hand against the movement, idly rubbing small circles, like you're tracing a map you haven't learned to read yet. Clothing has been your armour lately, less to protect you from the elements and more to shield you from people's eyes. Every morning you try to tie your shawl, just so, not because it's warm, but because it covers the curve of your belly from old Marjorie's judgmental glance. Not that it works. She always knows. Still, it's something. You think about the layers you wear like layers of identity. You, who are just another village girl on the surface, feel different when wrapped in your green hood, or when you borrow your brother's old jerkin, too big and too patched, but somehow freeing. Clothing is disguise and declaration all at once, a trick of fabric and faith. Take sumptuary laws, for instance. Remember, those you read or more likely heard, that at one point it was illegal for people of certain classes to wear specific fabrics. Velvet, for example, or fur-lined hoods. Unless you were nobility, those were forbidden luxuries. Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced or just symbolic gestures to keep the peasants in their lane. Either way, the message was clear: clothes are status, and status is sacred. You've never even touched velvet. You heard once it feels like stroking the inside of a cat's ear. Instead, your world is wool rough-spun and practical. Wool tunics, wool cloaks, wool stockings that itch more than they warm, and the occasional linen shift if you're lucky or rich. Linen breathes, they say, and if that's true, yours must be gasping for air. But here's the thing, even in your scratchy wool and coarse cloth you find beauty. Not beauty in the painted lady on a church wall way, but beauty in how you mend what tears, in how you stitch a falling hem while stirring stew, in how you add a row of blue thread to the neckline of a shift, not because it's necessary, but because it's yours. The church bells ring again, Vespers. You glance at the sun already dipping. Time moves fast when you're wrapped in chores and discomfort. Back in the house, your mother is rearranging bundles of dried herbs above the fire. She's muttering about mildew and mice. You know not to interrupt. You reach for your spindle instead and begin carding wool. The rhythm is oddly soothing. Card twist spin, card twist spin. You once read a tale, well heard it from that travelling bard about a girl who spun gold from straw. You laugh a little. If that were true, you'd be rolling in coin. But no, the only thing you've ever spun from straw is splinters, and a healthy dislike for your stool. Still, stories matter. They sow a seam between days. You find yourself whispering them as you work, murmuring old tales of saints and sinners and silk-clad queens, whose dresses dragged behind them like rivers. One such tale sticks with you. It's about a noblewoman who wore a dress so wide she couldn't fit through the chapel doors and had to be wed outside in the rain. The priest slipped. The groom sneezed. But the dress perfect. Historians still argue whether it was a real event or satire. Either way, it makes you grin. All that fabric and no room for practicality. You've never had that problem. Your skirts are narrow, functional. but you've seen what can happen when function fails. Remember the boy whose hose split during May Day dancing? He ran into the woods and wasn't seen for 3 days. Came back pretending he'd gotten lost. Everyone played along, except old Marjorie, who called him Moonbottom for a full year. And while we're talking fashion fails, let's not forget the time your cousin tried to dye a tunic with berries and ended up looking like she'd rolled in bruises. The colour lasted a week. The jokes lasted months. Outside, snow begins to fall. Just a few flakes at first, barely noticeable, then more soft, steady and silent. The thatch roof muffles the sound, and for a moment, everything feels distant, peaceful. You pause your spinning and walk to the door, opening it slowly so as not to startle the cat sleeping in the corner. The snow has blanketed the cart you just unloaded, turning the wool bundles into oddly shaped marshmallows. Your breath fogs the air. You pull your shawl tighter and lean against the doorway, watching as the flakes swirl like tiny scraps of lace torn from the sky. You wonder what it's like in the manor house down the road. Do they have velvet robes, thick mattresses? Do their fires never go out? Do they look at their clothes and think of them as armour as you do? Probably not. Still, you wouldn't trade places. Not really. There's a certain pride in surviving discomfort, in knowing your hands made what you wear, in knowing your stitches hold not just your seams but your story. And when your child is born, and they will be born, you remind yourself warm and whole you'll pass on that pride, that strength, and maybe one day they'll wear the same shawl, the one you embroidered by firelight, with thread that remembers. You pull the shawl closer and step back inside, brushing snowflakes from your sleeves as you go. The fire crackles lazily, throwing golden light across the packed dirt floor, and your mother glances up from her seat where she's threading a needle through the hem of your father's tunic. She doesn't say anything, just a glance, then back to her work. That's how warmth is shown here. Not in words, but in mended cuffs and another ladle of stew. You sit again, this time near your sister, who's diligently sorting turnips. One for supper, one for storage, one she's trying not to nibble. You give her a look, and she hides the bite mark with a guilty giggle. You don't say anything. Why would you? Who could resist a stolen bite in a house where sweetness is rare and rationed? You take out your needlework, the same square of rough linen you've been working on for days. A simple border, just leaves and loops. But each stitch is a breath, a pause, a way of anchoring yourself to something delicate in a world made of stone smoke and obligation. And as you sew, you think again of those medieval fashion choices that seem to modern eyes so absolutely bizarre. The horned headdresses, the extra long sleeves that dragged behind noble women like bridal trains collecting mud admiration, and probably a fair share of fleas. The ridiculously pointed shoes known as poulens that were so long they had to be tied to the leg with ribbon to prevent tripping. Historians still argue whether those styles were genuine expressions of beauty or exaggerated symbols of status, designed to prove one thing: I'm so rich, I don't have to be practical. But for you, practicality isn't a choice, it's a law as real and inescapable as the one that says you'll be up before sunrise again tomorrow, feeding the chickens, spinning the wool, fetching water from a well that always feels a little farther away when your back aches. Still, even in that practicality, there's ritual. You choose the red thread because it reminds you of berries in spring. You patch your brother's sock with a clumsy heart shape just because. You fold your shawl with care, laying it flat on the chest as though it were silk, not scratchy sheep's wool. And you wonder if someone found it centuries from now, what would they think? Would they see the uneven stitches and think you were unskilled? Or would they feel the story in it, the effort, the tenderness, the quiet act of mending something worn? The fire shifts. Sparks leap upward. Your father stands, stretches and groans in that way that says more about age than words ever could. He steps outside for wood, and your mother mutters about letting the heat out. Some things never change, no matter the century. You stare into the fire. The flames flick and curl, casting dancing shadows across the wall. You remember an old tale about a girl who spun so fast, her spindle caught fire, and her hair turned to gold. She became a legend, of course, because no one quite knew how to explain her, so they turned her into magic. That's what fashion does too, doesn't it? It turns necessity into spectacle. A fur-lined cloak isn't just warmth, it's power. A crimson belt isn't just decoration, it's a declaration. A hat shaped like a castle. Absurd, yes, but unforgettable. You smirk, thinking of how that would go down at the market. You striding through the stalls in a £10 hat shaped like a turret. Old Marjorie would faint. Your little sister would try to climb it. Someone would probably assume you were possessed. But here's the thing, fashion has always been about more than just fabric. It's a conversation between body and world, between fear and bravado, between what you want and what you're allowed to have. And in your world, what you're allowed is simple. Wool, linen if lucky, leather shoes so stiff they never quite break in, a belt made from braided twine, maybe a token at your neck, an old button or a carved bead passed down from your grandmother, who wore it when she was your age and just as tired. The candle burns low. Your sister dozes beside you now, head resting on a turnip like it's a pillow fit for a princess. Your mother is still at her sewing, though her eyes blink slow now, her stitches wandering. You cover your sister with an old blanket and lean back against the wall. The house creaks. The wind sighs. And your thoughts drift not to queens in their ivory towers or dukes with embroidered cuffs, but to your own hands, rough, red-knuckled, cracked from soap and weather, but strong. Hands that sew, mend, lift, feed, carry. Hands that hold. You rest them on your belly again. The baby is quiet tonight, maybe dreaming already. And you wonder, not for the first time, what they will wear one day. Whether their world will be softer. Whether they'll have clothes just for beauty, not just for work. Whether they'll laugh at your old tunics the way you laughed at horned headdresses. Whether they'll ever know what it was to turn a scrap of cloth into a shield. You hope they do. Because if they don't, they'll never know how powerful it can feel to wear something that tells your story stitch by stitch. The candle is nearly gone now, just a stub flickering in the little iron dish by the hearth, its light growing fainter as the cold deepens. You draw your knees to your chest, wrapping your arms around them, and listening to the slow rise and fall of your mother's breath. She's fallen asleep in the chair needle still threaded in hand. Your sister stirs, murmurs something soft, then settles again. Outside the world is ice and hush, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like time itself has curled up and dozed off. And in that stillness you think again about all the strange things people wore and what they meant. You picture that nobleman with his absurd sleeves dragging half the countryside behind him, or the woman with her jewelled girdle, each gem sewn by hand, worth more than your father's entire fence-post stash. And those crazy poulains again with the curled tips so long you wonder how anyone got anything done. And yet they did. Somehow, amid the mud and the plagues and the court intrigues and harvest festivals, people lived entire lives wrapped in these strange silhouettes. They fell in love while wearing brocade, gossiped under veils, argued in codpieces, danced with swan feathers stuck to their heads. And, you know, in your bones, that the point of all of it wasn't just fashion. It was memory, identity, armour. Because when your life is ruled by things you can't control, weather war, childbirth, hunger, you claim what power you can. Maybe that means walking taller in shoes that feel ridiculous. Maybe that means hemming your tunic with red thread just because you can. Historians still debate the symbolism behind certain garments. Why were bridal dresses often blue, not white? Was it just about dye costs, or did blue mean purity, long before Queen Victoria made white the standard? Why did sumptuary laws outlaw certain colours, or fabrics for commoners? Was it to preserve class distinction, or to protect the economy? They debate and they dig and they catalogue everything from doublets to girdles to medieval underwear. Yes, that's a whole field of study. And still, so much of it remains mysterious, just fragments of cloth and a few woodcut illustrations whispering half-truths across centuries. But you sitting here, belly full of new life and eyes rimmed with exhaustion, you don't need a textbook to understand why someone would wear something beautiful, even when the world is hard. You live it. You understand the magic of tying your hair just right, the quiet defiance of wearing a ribbon when there's no feast to attend, the pride in a tunic that still fits after 3 winters of wear. Even your brother, who grunts at everything and claims he doesn't care, has a favourite belt he wears on market days. It's cracked and ugly, but it makes him feel important, as if he's part of something a little bigger than fence posts and chicken feed. You glance toward your mother. The thread has slipped from her fingers. You reach over and gently pull the needle from her lap, setting it in the little basket beside her. The baby shifts, a soft kick, like a tap on the inside of a drum. You smile. Not because anything is easy, but because there's something comforting in the repetition, in the rhythms that stay the same even as the world outside spins strange. Tomorrow you'll wear the same tunic, pull on the same shoes, tie your hair back with the same bit of twine, but you'll stand a little straighter maybe. You'll nod a little slower at old Marjorie. Maybe you'll even hum while you sweep. Because fashion, weird as it seems in paintings or old scrolls, was never just about being noticed. It was about being human, about marking your place in a world that often forgot to ask your name, about showing that yes, you were here, you mattered, you stitched this, you wore this, you lived this life. And maybe, just maybe one day someone will hold what you wore, squint at the uneven seams and wonder who you were. And if they're lucky, they'll understand not just what you wore, but why. You shift under the blanket, the fire dies lower, and for the first time all day you let yourself sink fully into the floor. Not because there's no more work, but because even medieval peasants deserve a few moments of peace. Even if the mattress is straw, even if the wind still slips through the cracks, even if you still smell like turnips and sheep, you sleep because you must, and you dream because somewhere under all the soot and wool and daily noise there's still a spark of something gentle in you, something soft, something beautiful. And now the candle has burned itself out. The fire's glow has faded into embers, small orange coals breathing slowly like sleeping hearts. Outside, the snow whispers against the doorframe, and even the wind seems to tiptoe past your window. You're warm, you're safe, you're wrapped in wool in memory in the hush of 1,000 nights just like this one. And as you rest, the stories settle, the sleeve lengths, the ribbon superstitions, the tunics and belts and all the ways people once dressed to declare who they were or who they hoped to be. They may seem strange to us now, but they were never meaningless. Every hemline stitched with care, every thread pulled tight with hope. Fashion was not frivolous. It was survival. It was self-expression. It was resistance. So tonight, as you drift off, carry that thought with you, that the simplest act, tying a belt, brushing a cloak, pulling a shawl tighter, has always been more than just getting dressed. It's been a ritual, a quiet reclaiming of self, and maybe in your own way you still do it too. So breathe in and out, and let the layers of time soften around you. You are safe. You are whole. You are part of something much older than you know. Sleep well, traveller. We'll pick up the thread again soon. End of script. Sweet dreams.